It is 9 o'clock.
Let's do this.
Yeah. Lindsay.
Why don't you invite Lindsay to do the honors?
I will. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Good morning and welcome to the June 7th Hanford Advisory Board Tank Waste Committee meeting. Here for the Hanford site. I'd like to identify a few reminders before we get started. The first one is this meeting will be conducted in accordance with the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And the second one is each member has a joint responsibility for assuring that the operating ground rules are observed and that discussions are conducted in a respectful manner. I appreciate your attendance today and I look forward to the meeting. Rob?
Thank you. Today's meeting is, we're going to have a couple presentations from DOE. And then the last part, we're going to have a discussion or open forum where we can in next year. And so yeah, let's go ahead. Ruth, any announcements that you can think of?
I got some housekeeping stuff. The presentations, the two presentations we'll have today are posted on the hanford.gov website, so you can get them. There are also some copies over here if you're a hard copy person. When you're speaking, we like to look at the person we're talking to. In this forum, speaking to the owls in the middle will help the folks online hear you better. If you're having a side conversation, the owl will pick it up and point at you. So if you need to do that, stay away from the owls. We've got 12 people online and 16 in the room. So again, there's more people here than you see. For signing in, Sue Coleman has again blessed you with cookies. That's the bribe for signing in if you're in the room. If you're online, please sign in through the chat so we know you're here with your name and your affiliation. If you haven't got an ecology badge, that's their system, so make sure you sign in there. The bathrooms and the water fountain are back over my left shoulder before the big double doors. And in the event we have to leave quickly, there's a door here, there's the front door and the staging areas out in the parking lot. If that. Did I forget anything, Ryan?
Nope. Recording.
Oh, yes, I did forget something. We record all the committee meetings, so you are being recorded. You need to know that. And we put the recordings of committee meetings on the Hanford website along with the meeting materials and the meeting notes. So, and Josh, when he does that production, actually tags which presentation starts at some time, so you don't have to run through the whole recording if you're looking for something specific.
So I think, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody here coming to the meeting and encourage other members of the committee to come to these meetings. They're pretty easy to get to and we run them pretty efficiently. Second thing is, I think Ruth here has made some great accomplishments in your career.
Oh.
And she unfortunately will be leaving us before too long, or at least that's the indication. But you want to tell us a little bit about you being one of 12 in the entire country that has the skills and the talents to do what you do?
Okay, let's see, 3 sentences. The basic professional accreditation for facilitators is an international accreditation to, it's called a certified professional facilitator. It's like getting your CPA or passing the bar exam. It's a basic thing. And the highest level of certification is called master. And last month I was made a CPF master. And in the United States, and there are about 57 in the world.
So you're going to be in high demand.
So,
No, thank you, and we'll really miss you, your skill. Okay, so, Matt, are you ready to give us a talk in?
Sure. Do I get to pick my seat of choice in the
Yeah.
front?
yes, you do.
All right. Okay,
Matt, could you first give us a little background about yourself?
yeah, that's where I'm headed.
Okay, good deal.
All right, good morning. So my name is Matt Irwin. I'm the Deputy Assistant Manager for the WTP project on behalf of the Department of Energy. DFLAW started up and operational, getting through the commissioning string and getting into hot commissioning. But then obviously my support Tom in the HLW side of the equation as well. So been here at Hanford for the last, it'll almost be 30 years here pretty soon. Most of which has been with the department, starting in the world of the facility rep world at places like 324 K basins and those fun places. I've been with the ORP side and WTP for the last 5 years, and been working on getting DFLAW started up. But that doesn't mean I don't keep my hand in some of the facility related and design related activities at HLW. So just to give you a frame of reference for the talk today, I'll be talking about both the design period scope of work, how we're ramping up that scope of work to support finishing the design for HLW, such that HLW can support the waste acceptance criteria as it stands today. That can all be done in parallel with the other regulatory activities that are ongoing, which are the, as was announced, the agreement in principle related to the AOA, the ongoing holistic negotiations to work out those details and regulatory requirements, and then how that flows into the overall tank waste treatment mission. That'll all occur here over time, but we have enough information to be able to support design of the HLW facility and its associated systems and working through our well, anyways, I don't want to give you too much of my presentation because then you'll have already heard my message. So any questions on that before I go forward, or otherwise I'll start. So it's gonna be a little weird because I'll make sure we're on the right slide, but I have to look to my left. So I'll apologize for that. But like I said, the point is to talk about the HLW facility, where we are and where we're headed relative to the design period for that facility. Basically right now we're rebaselining the HLW facility to support the consent decree to get us through the design period and then get into construction and commissioning. I'm going to go over a high-level notional schedule that talks about those various elements. Talk about the major evolutions for the design period, and then our fiscal year 24 planned work scope. So if we can go to the next slide. This really just shows the notional, what the facility will look like. Right now, there's a number of low risk activities like installing shield doors, some crane rails, doing some of the work on evaluating the paper that supports the various pieces of equipment that we have here and making sure that they're current and not obsolete, or that there haven't been other challenges. And then the other focus from a construction standpoint, so it'll be very limited while we finish the design, is weathering in the facility and doing that in a way in the areas where there's a low risk for having to go do rework. Next slide. Okay, so this is just talking about the announcements of alternatives from a process standpoint. It was a structured process that had been used across the department and industry to look at various alternatives. It follows the 22 steps of the GAO office to look at alternatives. There were 5 steps in the State Department of Ecology, and then from that, that led us to where we are today, which is the announcement of the agreement in principle and then the public comment period that just recently closed. And just for frame of reference, that kicked off in 2019. And that'll continue here on through the rest of this year. Next slide. This just gives a little bit more detail. There were 17 alternatives initially reviewed. There was number 17 happens to be the one that was scored highest. From that, the team looked at running an additional scenario that was then identified as alternative 18. State of Washington requested some additional criteria and sensitivity studies to go along with that. And then, as I mentioned, the public feedback period was between January 19th and April 28th. Next slide. The other parallel path that we've gone on is DFLAW. We've got a lot of lessons learned. The single biggest lesson learned, and it's a pretty significant one, is that the design build approach had a number of vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So we switched to a design then build, which is your more traditional approach. Now that's a little bit complicated because the facility is already partially constructed. So that means going back and making sure that we got a solid design that matches up with the configuration of the facility, which matches up with the equipment that we've procured, and making sure that we got all of that in order and aligned and addressed based upon the time frame that we've been in pause from a construction standpoint, and then moving forward on that. So it's a little bit more deliberate approach than the parallel path design build approach that was initially started for overall WTP. So we created an optimization team to look at what are those things that we need to consider as lessons learned from DFLA. Design then build is one good example. Relooking at our code of record and making sure that we refresh that so that we're taking advantage of those changes in overarching, primarily design, but there's also a number of other requirements that go along with it, and make sure we refresh those, taking those into account on our path forward. Looking at some of the lessons we've learned relative to aging and obsolescence, that interface between the digital portions of the design of the plant and the actual physical portions of the design of the plant. So there's over 20 different sub-teams that we created to go look at those lessons learned, make sure that they're instituted into the HLW path forward. Another good example is as part of DFLA, we put together a QA war room that looked at the consumer grade dedication and making sure we had a rigorous and defendable QA program and that it was documented clearly and effectively. So that's being instituted to make sure the same thing is occurring for HLW path forward. Let's see, I think I've covered everything on that slide. And then the other part of it is from the standpoint of the technical scope. So the contract as written covers all of WTP, including the DFLA and HLW. So we want to revisit that, make sure that we've got the right contract language to support the design period, which is we have an RFP and a change order, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't use acronyms, so I apologize on that. We have a request for proposal, and I'm sure most of you already understand that language, but I'm going to try to stay out of acronyms. And a change order that'll be issued here in the near term within the next month. That'll define that design period scope that goes from 23 to 27. Part of the effort that we're looking at is where are the right places for that integration between Waste Feed, which is the tank farms contractor, and HLW and its design effort, and then rolling into its wholesale construction and commissioning effort, which will nominally start in the 2027 timeframe. Oh, and then the last one is from a project standpoint, we've gone through a lot of feedback and improvement areas at DFLA relative to our project controls and our earned value management system. So we want to make sure that we take those lessons learned and those changes to the processes and roll them into the HLW, both from a contractual scope standpoint and making sure that that's effectively covered in the contract, as well as from an implementation standpoint from the contractor's perspective, which that part isn't as big a lift because those are the practices that have been in place to support completion of DFLA. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a high-level status. We have a total of 59 systems. It's also from a nuclear safety standpoint, we do have a preliminary documented safety analysis. It is a hazard category 2 facility that is where it has been and will remain. That's starting in this year is focused on low-risk work, things like the shield doors and the crane rails, and then working towards weathering in the facility. And then the last bullet, really, one of the things we found that's been hugely beneficial for DFLA is making sure that we have mission integration across DOE Hanford. So for DFLA, and this will be the same for HLW, for DFLA, we have a lot of interfaces with the other prime contractors, making sure those interfaces are well defined, making sure that they're managed on a regular basis and updated when necessary. So that same mission integration approach is being rolled out to support HLW as we ramp up in our level of activity and get our way through the design period. Next slide. Okay, so I talked a little bit about it from the standpoint of the contract change. So as I mentioned, the change order and the request for proposal from the department standpoint will go out here in the next month. In parallel with that, the contractor has started their proposal for performing that design work over the design period and what limited construction, low-risk construction would occur during that time frame. There's a number of other planning activities that support the direct feed HLW concept. That includes flow sheets, that includes looking at the various HLW feed and making sure that we have the right front-end waste feed delivery systems and processes in place. So that goes on in parallel with all of the regulatory activities that I mentioned earlier, that then would roll in and could impact our waste acceptance criteria. We don't expect that to be any significant impacts from the standpoint of what HLW can handle. And then the other thing that also goes along with that is the enhanced waste glass methodologies for glass recipes. So that is an opportunity that can widen that window of aperture for HLW, but it has not gone all the way through its process to be actually implemented. So those are things that go on in parallel with my primary focus, which is getting the facility designed such that we can get back into construction and commissioning down the road. I already mentioned the lessons learned, and then the rebaseline for the construction, startup testing, and commissioning, that would occur in nominally it would start in 2026 timeframe, such that we've got the contract change definitized, negotiated, and in place to support going into the wholesale construction and commissioning. And that should also be able to take advantage of finishing the holistic negotiations and the other regulatory activities that are ongoing today. So that's the end of the material I brought.
All right, let's check in with ecology and then we'll start with questions and comments. Are you up, Dan?
I'm up. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for your presentation. A couple of things to consider. The first of which is the plans that Matt is talking about are just that, the plans. We have an existing consent decree and we have an existing tri-party agreement, which has requirements for the Department of Energy to finish certain things and to complete certain things at date certain. Until those consent decrees and tri-party agreements have in fact been renegotiated, Ecology's position is that's what we're working with. We appreciate what's going on with high level waste. We're getting some permit information now, and we're doing what we can internally to help move that forward. All of that said, holistic negotiation, system planning, analysis of alternatives, and other initiatives that are ongoing at this point are not the regulatory drivers. The consent decree and the tri-party agreement are. Any changes to those will be certainly way above my pay grade in terms of management and legal, and those will have to be undertaken before we have a new frame of reference for going forward on the project. So just keep in mind, when you hear something about a particular date, that's all well and certain, but we need to get through, if you will, the hoops, not only technical, but regulatory and those kinds of things to ensure that we have a consistent view of the project going forward. Ruth?
All right. So I've got Pam and Q. We've got 18 people online. So if you're online, let us know in the chat if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Pam.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Following on what Dan said, in talking to friends that work at HLW, what we've heard is that things were on hold until you knew what your feed was going to be. And you don't know what your feed is going to be until the holistic negotiations are done and there's modification to the path forward. So I'm excited to see progress, but I feel being held up by a process that's out of your control.
So that doesn't really hold up the finishing of the design of the HLW facility. That most of those impacts will occur on the feed side to making sure because there's always been a window of material characteristics to receive to actually turn it into glass. So that part's not going to change dramatically. So from the standpoint of designing the HLW facility and its associated systems, we can still proceed at that, not through completion, but through the vast majority of the design of those physical systems, HVAC systems, off-gas systems, based upon that waste acceptance criteria that we already know represents what it takes to make good glass. So there are some variables on the front end on how the waste gets delivered. But those are things that we can deal with from a feed delivery standpoint, not from a how we make glass. That makes sense.
Okay, so, to me, a related question is, what is direct feed high-level waste? What is it? Where does it come from?
So so it comes from the analysis of alternatives, and there are lots of details, but it's an approach that would basically tailor in the feed vector at the tank farms or between the tank farms and WTP, and not necessarily occur in the, at least some elements of that, not necessarily occur in the pretreatment facility as originally envisioned. So some of those aspects, and part of that comes from the success that we've had using TSCR to support DFLAW and recognizing how that has, now law and HLW are not the same, so I'm not trying to imply those two are the same. But the approach is similar, being able to deal with any blending or mixing before it comes over to HLW, such that when we receive it at WTP, we're receiving it within a band of waste acceptance criteria, and then we go make good glass out of it.
So would that include the canisters of cesium and strontium that are being generated?
Not as far as I know. I can't answer that question.
Oh.
Cesium and strontium, as far as I know, that's not part of the WTP.
Pam, one of the things to keep in mind is when Matt talks about not using the pretreatment facility as we know it today, my words, keep in mind that pretreatment capability is still on the table. Characteristically, what it might look like, how it's going to be used in the process control strategy, that depends on the alternatives that are being evaluated now and what this likely end up being. That said, some measure of pretreatment capability, whether it's blending, whatever it is still going to be required for the process control strategy to work correctly and well.
Yeah, and if I wasn't clear, that is exactly in line with what I was trying to say.
So let me paraphrase. Then you're following an AOA recommendation as if it is going to be. No. We are designing the HLW facility consistent with the waste acceptance criteria that currently stands that supports the consent decree today. Okay,
The
so
variables that may change are how that feed is delivered to HLW to support that waste acceptance criteria.
So we're aware of the interface control document,
Mhm.
which specified what would be fed to pre-treat in order to make high-level waste acceptable for the high-level waste facility. Now, is that document going to be renegotiated?
I can't really speak
Because-
to the negotiation of that. I can speak to what we're designing the HLW facility to do, which is to take the input, which the input hasn't changed. And as Dan mentioned, and as I tried to mention before, how that material is dealt with from a feed standpoint, that may vary, whether it's some portion of the pretreatment facility or some alternative method, but that's not part of designing the HLW facility. Or constructing it. for that
Okay,
matter.
so it just, in summary, you're saying that we're designing the HLW facility to take feed from a direct source from tank farms, skipping over.
There will be, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have another facility between the two.
Oh, right. There may
But
be
yes.
another tank or two or cannibalize something and,
But-
you know, you've got some huge vessels in.
Yeah, so there's a number of alternatives on how that would get handled.
Right.
And then the other variable that could impact that is, and this also is not in place, so it's not part of the design today, but that enhanced waste glass can also have impacts on that aperture from an HLW standpoint. But we are not designing to that. We
Right.
just recognize it's another variable in play.
Right. Well, you have 3 other evaporators in that retreat building.
Sure.
You know, they're gonna go to waste unless they're purposed. So, okay,
I've
Please.
got 4 people in queue. I've got Rob, Dan Solitz online, Tom, and Jacob. Rob?
Along with the same discussion, in your presentation, it says direct feed HLW concept being evaluated. So is this something new that we're taking a look at? Something different than what we originally decided?
It's looking at the flow sheet and what are the various sensitivities based upon the various parameters and HLW feed over time.
Okay, so what is currently, I don't want to say currently in place, but maybe the correct terminology, may change based on the evaluation going on.
How the material gets blended or the waste feed delivery aspects may change.
Mhm.
The actual operation of how we make glass and how we receive the material, that won't
That won't
change.
change. Okay,
The only variable that could change that, and it's a different set of equations, is the enhanced waste glass recipe could open that aperture somewhat from an HLW standpoint. But that is also not in place and we're not designing for that.
Sure.
So just to be very clear.
okay, thanks.
Dan Solitz, you're with us online. What's on your mind?
Good morning. Waste acceptance criteria. When you say that, are you talking about the waste acceptance criteria for the interim storage or waste acceptance criteria for final storage
No, I'm
or
actually
waste
talking
acceptance?
for HLW. You're talking about the back end when you ask that question. I'm talking about how we receive the tank waste from the tank farms to support making glass at HLW.
So just the waste acceptance criteria for the vitrification plant.
How we make the glass, yes.
Okay, that kind of leaves the back end open. And I mean, I don't understand how you can do a waste acceptance criteria if you don't have a final disposal site. So you're not designing to the site.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything on the back end that's changing at all, not that I'm aware of. And Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think
No, I'm
there's
with you.
anything on the back end. So all of that is exactly in line with the quality of glass and the materials that we've intended to treat through HLW since the beginning of this project. So there isn't any discussion that I'm aware of that talks about changing the back end.
Okay, can I explain something? That you gotta know what we're missing in pre-treat to understand what you're saying that goes to HLW. Pre-treat brought the waste in. 4 big lines, brought it into the pre-treat facility. It mixed it, it sent it over to the UFP process where it was digested, and the aluminum, which was used to neutralize the waste, was put in huge amount of quantities in the waste. And so that is not radioactive, and that would go to the LAW facility in the separations process. They would also do a strontium strike to separate that, an oxidative leaching, or a very high pH in the UFP system or the ultra filtered system. Then it would filter it, then separating the LAW from the HLW. The HLW would then go to another set of tanks, and then be evaporated and concentrated, ready to send to the actual melter facility for then blending with the right proportions of glass formers and et cetera in the big blending tanks that they have in the HLW facility. So what it means by taking direct feed is that we're gonna get a lot of aluminum in our waste. We're gonna get a lot of stuff that
You
was supposed to be
extrapolated.
separate.
That isn't necessarily true. That
The
isn't
volume
necessarily
of
true.
logs the volume of high level waste will increase.
I haven't seen numbers that support that. I came to discuss with you what we're doing for the HLW facility and the path forward on the HLW facility. There are lots of other aspects, there are lots of other variables. Absolutely agree with that, because what you just described also doesn't take into account the fact that we're doing the DF law as we are.
Agreed.
So
Yeah.
that variable's already been in place, and we're on the cusp of heating up the melter here within the next week. So it's very complicated, and I'm sure those can be broken down into pieces, and we can talk about each of those pieces when the right time is in place. But I came to talk to you about the design period of the HLW facility, what we're doing for the facility specifically. And I understand why you would say, hey, if I make these assumptions on the front end, that means it's gonna affect the HLW facility in the back end. But that's not something that I came prepared to talk about, and I'm not sure I actually agree with it, but that's okay. Those can all be talked about in their own time. And by the way, I'm sure from the standpoint of holistic negotiations and any changes that do get made, those are all variables that are being discussed as part of that. But that doesn't mean we can't safely and effectively design the facility based upon the parameters that we know we were always gonna use to make good glass.
Oh, yeah, and I recognize that the HLW facility is very robust. Being
Right.
able to take almost anything.
And I know you're not
and
implying
glass.
otherwise.
Right.
I'm just trying to make sure that we're not straying from the topic that I came here to talk about. I mean,
Right.
I understand there's lots of variables, and I don't mean to imply, by the way, that they're simple or that some of them aren't gonna require some other adjustments that right now haven't been made. But I can say with pretty good certainty that we can make a facility that can make good glass, and it's gonna be with very minimal, exceptions, exactly what we need.
But just following up on Pam's point.
No, that's
that-
fair.
that It's a direct feed process that we're preparing for.
And I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm just trying to make sure we stay within the box of what I'm here to talk to you about. That's all.
Okay, got a couple more people in queue.
Thanks, Matt.
Ruth, if I might,
Yeah.
Matt. Rob, one of the things you may want to consider in terms of looking at the differences that you're talking about in terms of what goes forward and what doesn't, in terms of chemicals and stuff. In the initial AOA report, there is a chart that has the first 17 alternatives considered. You may remember washing, bleaching, and a variety of other kinds of things are in there. And for those alternatives where that particular function is being considered, it shows you the possibility of where those functions would in fact be performed. All of which leads up to the processing of high-level waste glass. The differences are how you get there through these various alternative processes. Again, remembering that not a particular alternative has been chosen yet. These are just things that are being looked at. So washing, leaching, this, that, and the other thing are shown a variety of places in the process control strategy, depending on the alternative being considered.
Yeah. Again, my point was that the interface control document that the plant was originally built and spec'd on is gonna be preserved
For HLW.
for
That's
HLW.
correct.
Right.
Alright. So I've got Tom and Jacob. Tom?
So, first, I really appreciate the design then build, strategy. Makes sense, measure twice, cut once, all those things. It's gotta be daunting though, when you don't know what the feed is. And really, we don't even know what the back end waste acceptance criteria for the facility that these canisters are going to is. So how much nimbleness are you building into the design? Or is that all in glass formulation, to get to the output? I mean, we're designing logs for Yucca, which is not gonna happen. So what are these logs? If the new facility that comes up one of these days has a different acceptance criteria that, that is different from Yucca and requires some tweaks to the plant, and it's built and it's, what do we do?
So, as was mentioned earlier, HLW is very robust. One of the other elements for glass that gets made, hopefully we've got those decisions in place before we're making that glass. So I guess I'll just say that up front, right? Because I think we all know if the glass is made, then you're limited. I'll say it that way, significantly. But we also know what quality of glass we've intended to make, and we're still making that same level of glass. But you talked about nimbleness. One of those is we know what we've seen at DFLAW and from the off-gas train and some of the constituents that come off the melter that create some limiting conditions. We know that if we use the thermocatalytic oxidizer off of LAW, that's gonna open up our ability to allow the melters to have more flexibility on what they off-gas. So that's an example of somewhere where we're looking from a design standpoint to put the thermocatalytic oxidizer design from LAW, which is a larger, more robust system, into HLW to help open that somewhat on the how we're making glass and any limitations from the standpoint of releases off of the cold cap. And we'll continue to look for those. So I can't give you the full list because we're still in the design period and we're, as you've already pointed out, part of this is making sure we had proceeded to the period where we are now. We put it on a pause. We all know that's not a good thing for a project. So now we got to make sure all of that equipment, all of the things that we had done up to this point still support the finishing of the design and the construction of the facility. In some cases, we've procured things that we may not use that equipment because of either the time or because there's something today that can do that more effectively. And so those, fully expect those to come out in the context of design. And the benefit is we won't have half installed it by the time we decide it's either obsolete or we need to change it. That'll come on the back end of the design period when we get into the construction period. So I know that's not a fully satisfying answer, but I would tell you that we absolutely understand that need for flexibility and are trying to look at those opportunities to open apertures on each of the aspects of the facility. Some of them may be a no, never mind. So hopefully some of them add to improved effectiveness and life of those components, right? They may not allow us to improve the end product or open the front end, the waste acceptance criteria. But if they allow us to be more effective at operating the facility, then that's still a win, right? If that lowers our time in outage to do maintenance, then that's still a win because that accelerates the overall treatment mission. So those are all things that we're looking at. But I know those don't answer that core concern that you asked. I mean,
That's a great answer. Thank you.
All right, I've got Jacob, Rob Parmalee, and Steve. Jacob.
I guess my question, and so, I nearly started out my career at the High Level Waste Facility and I designed all the things that I think are gonna work. And I don't have any of the fears that they've raised. I think it's one of the most flexible facilities and part of it is because it was over-designed. It can make 6 metric tons a day, feeding it just about anything while an 8.0 earthquake is going on. I look at a DFLA scenario and I know who's working on that, so DFHLW, so I also have low fear of that. My concern is if your design basis is still 6 metric tons a day in a DFHLW scenario, it'd be one thing to say that you design it so that it is capable of doing that. It would be another to say that, are you gonna design it so it will day in, day out, 365 days a year through asphalt and blizzard and earthquake? And I'm exaggerating on that a little bit. I hope, get 6 metric tons a day, or are you gonna allow it to be flexible to make 6 metric tons a day with its design basis speed?
So we aren't intending to change that what I would tell you, this is my personal hope. My personal hope is that we find when we operate DFLA, we're gonna find that it's more effective. And when we get into the operations mode, and that we were conservative in all of our assumptions. If that's the case, that'll support being able to apply those same attributes and lessons learned to HLW. So we're not changing the design criteria, but that doesn't mean that we can't outperform that, right? So
Sure, yeah.
that's our goal regardless. That's our goal in DFLA today. And will continue to be as we go forward. Well, I'll just use another example. Although the first melter of DFLA will get changed out in its 5-year frequency, based upon what we learned from that, the other ones may be longer or shorter. I think there's a pretty good prediction that they'll be longer, and longer will support the tank waste treatment mission better. So that's just a really easy single example. I expect there's gonna be hundreds of those. Now, some of them won't, some of them will not be in our favor. We'll find we have to do an outage and maintenance on something twice as much as we intended. There'll be some of those. I don't know what they are, but there'll be some. But there will also be those that will be to our benefit, and the intention is to go manage those such that has the maximum impact to the success of the tank waste treatment mission. And I would expect some of what you're talking about will evolve and emerge as well. And I too have confidence that we're gonna have more benefits than negatives, but I also know the proof is in the pudding, so I'm not gonna prematurely say that's where we're gonna end up. But as an engineer, I have some confidence based upon what I've spent the time on DFLA so far. But that all of that last couple sentences, that's personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the department to say that's where we end up. I'm just giving my personal opinion on the ground we've covered in DFLA. So,
Matt,
anyways, sorry.
I really appreciate you helping us with the acronyms because there's a wide range of familiarity with Hanford speak in the room. I know HLW is high level waste. What's FHLW?
The direct feed.
No, he said direct feed HLW.
Oh, you said direct feed? Okay,
Direct
I heard
feed,
it,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I may have said that.
Okay, okay.
If I
Well,
did,
that-
I meant feed.
Okay, that's my ears. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't another acronym that we were using and.
No, I appreciate you asking the question.
All right.
DFHLW.
Right.
Okay, got it. All right, Rob Parmalee.
In your presentation, you brought up the fact that there is a lessons learned group, I guess. It's looking at applying lessons learned from construction of DF law to HLW. And I think that might help address what Tom was asking, because the design and construction of DF law is probably the poster child for trying to design something that you have no idea what's gonna be the end result. So, and I think it's a pretty good sized group that's part of that lessons learned.
Yeah, no, there's, like I said, there's, I don't know the exact number, it's right around 20 various teams. And I'll just re-give those examples. There's a code of record team that's looking at how we refresh the requirements for the design going forward. There's a group that's looking at, there's a group that's looking at the systems that we learned how they operate and what they're doing at DF law and how does that impact HLW. There are some key decision points on the various support systems in BOF and how we roll. I'll just give you an easy example. Although the steam plant works just fine from the standpoint of delivering steam, we have found that those particular boilers don't turn down very well. And what I mean by that is they like to operate at about 60%. They don't like to operate at where DF law really only needs maybe 10 or 20. They don't like that. So we end up having a lot of steam that's going out the sky valve so that those boilers are operating effectively and efficiently. I guess I should put quotes around efficiently. The boiler making steam is efficient, but the actual use of the fuel is not efficient. So one of the things from a BOP standpoint is looking at going to electric steam generation. So on the front end of HLW, we will go ahead and design the switchgear and put the steam plants in that are electrically generated on the front end. That'll support both DF law, test out that they function effectively, and then as HLW ramps up, they'll be in place to support. That's a system-related lesson learned that we're taking from DF law and we're applying more broadly to WTP, including HLW. But there's a whole array of those kinds of things. And I don't think there's any reason that the overall lessons learned can't be shared. And if you guys want a more detailed discussion of that, I don't think that's particularly hard either. But just to give you some examples, and those are just the ones off the top of my head.
Okay. I've got Steve and Tom. Steve?
Yeah, thanks for this. I guess you mentioned and I caught that the melter was gonna start up again. Do you have a date for when the restart?
The
is
next
gonna
week or
be?
two.
Next week or two?
Resuming melter heat up.
Okay.
So the dual heater power supply, testing, we've got load banks installed on those. Those have all been tested out. And right now, each of the crews are going through proficiency. Sorry, I'm staring outside my box. But this is something I do every day, so I apologize. That's not, but yeah, we're within a couple weeks of being in the resuming melter heat up.
Great. Glad to hear that. Thanks.
Tom?
So Rob sort of touched on this, but the lessons learned team and all these work groups, is there gonna be public facing outputs of this? And if not, if there's gonna be at least a public discussion that can be had, is that something that you'd be willing to bring back to this committee?
So not that I'm aware of, but to be fair, there might be a subcommittee or two that have an aspect of that. I just don't, from the top of my head, I can't think of one, but there might be. I don't know why there's not any reason there can't be a discussion. I mean, these are all pretty, I mean, I don't want to say common sense, but they're pretty straightforward lessons learned anyway. And I don't think there is any reason we can't have additional dialogue on that. But I don't know of any plan to directly answer your question.
If you had to put on a magic hat, what timeline would you look at that discussion being right? Is that a year? Is that?
No, lessons learned? No, that would be, and by the way, I can't wear magic hats, but I would say it's much shorter than that. So we're expecting the change order to go out in the next month. The RFP would be in the end of or I guess I'll say early in the next fiscal year. And I would think that that's probably a good time to have a deeper dialogue on those lessons learned. I mean, like I said, there isn't anything magical about them, but I think they're all things that, if you think about them, you're like, okay, that makes sense. I mean, you know, the easy one, and it's really easy, is guess what? Requirements have, in some cases, improved, in a lot of cases changed, and relooking at those is just a smart thing to do. You know, I know a lot of people, typical project management would say, oh, you don't want to ever change your requirements. Sometimes that's to the benefit of the overall project. Sometimes it's not, but if you're doing that in a risk-informed, conservative way, you're gonna get the maximum benefit out of the intention of those codes and requirements. And hopefully you can leverage that to actually improve your overall facility. That's my goal. So, but that's just an example.
So when, nobody else. in
No
mind.
one's else in queue.
Right. So, you went down a list of different things that you were working on, and one you hit on the, how difficult it is to procure, quality equipment. And, meeting in your QA, war room, and what you did with the, war room, decisions on giving us the ability to know that we are procuring good quality equipment for the facility.
Yeah, and I don't think I actually said it's difficult to procure it. What I actually said was we've shown weaknesses in how it got documented and whether that objective evidence was defendable in all cases. So it's not so much that the equipment may or may not have the quality that you ask for, but if the documentation doesn't demonstrate it, then you don't. Right? I mean, that's the reality.
Right.
I'm only parsing your words because I wasn't necessarily saying procuring it was hard, but I will say that making sure the documentation lines up with the functions of the material, that any testing or any things that have been done to demonstrate that those procurements support their functions, particularly safety functions, but in all cases, it's whatever function you procured it for, that we have the documentation to show that it meets that and that all the requirements have been addressed. For DF law, we definitely, and HLW2, we definitely found there were weaknesses in documentation that we had to go back, in some cases, go back to the vendor, and in some cases, we have to replace it.
Yeah, right.
So that's the effort. And that, right, I mean, I say that in a sentence to make it sound like, it's not a straightforward thing. It's pretty significant.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, maybe I missed the.
Well, actually, because there's a lot of new people here, and the whole war room activities concerning QA and the procurement of equipment qualified equipment went on for years. And they finally reached some resolutions, and maybe you could describe what those resolutions were.
So the way the QA war room, and this is very simplistic, so I'm gonna give you, there's lots of moving parts. But at the end of the day, the QA war room, which I was directly involved in, was what's the documentation we have in place? What was the safety function? What are the overarching requirements, and what did we receive? And where those four don't match up, what does it take to match them up? In some cases, I'll just use some easy examples. In some cases, the documentation exists, but you had to go back to the vendor to get it, right? It doesn't do us any good to have great testing documentation at the vendor that 5 years from now, when we install, and I'm making this up, but 5 years from now, when we install it, we don't have that documentation to demonstrate it performs the function you procured it for. So in some cases, it was going back to the vendor to get that paper. In some cases, it was having to go do some additional testing on those components before they got installed. In some cases, and this was actually pretty limited, honestly. It was very limited that we had components that we said, well, we can't really use that. That was not the typical. The typical was there was documentation. It was in some other location that either wasn't readily available, or there were disconnects between the language used in the procurement documents and the documents we received to support the quality, the functions of the component. And we had to make sure that those got aligned. And sometimes it was just how the words were chosen. And we had to obviously have to go through a formal process to technically evaluate, for example, if we asked for something that really wasn't what we needed, did what we get actually support what we really needed? And then how do you go develop that consumer grade dedication package to say, what did we really need? And then get all the right people to have looked at it. And I apologize. I know that's very high level and simplistic, but I'm just trying to describe that's how you work through and you disposition all of those. And I would tell you, because this is before my time, but we're in the design build phase, you're trying to do all that stuff in parallel. You're not taking the time to take a step back and say, hold it, does all my paper match up? And that's part of what we're driving in this design period, is making sure that the physical matches the paper matches the actual design. And if those don't align, you gotta go fix wherever the delta occurs. So I'm sorry, and I didn't mean to delay your question.
Oh, no, I've got time. I've got it in mind. You had a couple slides on the AOA. You know, it's not a decision document. You say here that alternative 17 scored highest in the initial run. Was that included after ecology put their comments for?
No, that was literally just the initial run of the raw data that got put in.
How long would the high level waste program be running under that alternative?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
If I remember right, that's the one that was one of the longest runs.
I can't speak to that. I don't know that off the top of my head. Like I said, my focus today was to talk to you about what we're doing today and where HLW as a facility is going. I know there's lots of machinations on how those alternatives, you know, what other criteria have been applied, whether their sensitivity studies have been done, but I can't speak to them specifically.
I know it's not a decision document. There's a lot more work to be done. I was wondering if that was something you knew of.
Yeah, no, I apologize. That's not something off the top of my head.
Yeah, I just, I'm thinking back to the question that I asked, and I asked it inappropriately. So in the concept of direct feed for HLW, the containers at TSCR that are containing the cesium and strontium taken out of the low activity waste, are they
Oh,
feed,
that.
not the ones from
Okay.
Wesson?
I'm sorry.
I asked-
Okay, and I was thinking west of.
Yeah.
So, I can't answer that specifically, because it's just not something I know off the top of my head. That's something I could go pull the string on and get you an answer. I know the exact answer exists, that's not
Thank you.
something. So,
Okay.
What other questions?
Are
Let's see.
15 minutes early.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I could say something about that last subject, okay? And as a materials person, I've paid a lot of attention to the TSCR and what we're doing for the extraction of the cesium and strontium. It's very similar to a program that in 2000 we ran with CBC, Columbia Basin College, and I believe it was Parsons out there by the railroad tracks in Pasco. They built some tanks and they tested for the Savannah River site what was called monosodium titanate. Because of their waste is more acidic, the titanate was used to extract the cesium from the liquid waste. The reason why it was such a great advance at the time was the fact that it's all mineral. Okay, and the last thing you want to put into a high-level waste melter is organic materials. So organic resins are typically used for extraction of, demineralization and cleaning. So it's been several years, but in some of the original documents that were studied, this product called crystalline silicon titanate, okay, was also tested in some preliminary, but it didn't really work for Savannah River. So here we are 20 some odd years later, and now silicon, crystallized silicon titanate is what we're now using in our TSCR operations. The first batch was used a resin, okay, and to prove the concept. And the second few batches have been using the CST, they call it. And the reason why I'm pretty pleased about that and I have a direct question, is that being that it is all mineral, it makes it adaptable to be able to use or to feed into the high-level waste melter and be incorporated into glass. Though there are different glass combinations and formulas, and it's just like grout. Every batch that's going to come from the plant is going to have a tweak the mixture a little bit. And that's why the big silos on the site for blending the waste slurries into the right composition to make glass. So I'm real pleased about using the CST. Okay, and I think that's really a good thing. what I've asked for is some information as to the efficiency of the CST and how they would measure it. And the answer I got yesterday from some folks down at the work, at the development district, and CST, they said to me that the columns are still a little contaminated with organics in the first couple runs. So they weren't fully a CST specific media. And so the future runs, and they think maybe the third or fourth or one of those runs is when they're gonna finally start doing some good chemical analysis and look at the efficiencies of the CSTs using in the TSCR operation. So so that's what I know so far about what's going on with the CST and as a materials person, I think it's a great improvement instead of using the organic resins in the demineralization or the extraction process of the CZ. Any other comments on that? Please bring it up.
Not on the CST, but the enhanced glass formulations. I know you are designing the building to your decrees as they stand already. Is that a materials issue? We were just talking about some materials, or is that a different technique?
No, it's not a tech, it's just different recipes.
Okay, materials.
They still doing their recipes out at 22S Lab?
Yeah, that's right, sorry. When you said it, I thought you had the wrong number, but.
Yeah.
I don't have anything.
Okay, so we are gonna break for, do you want to speed everything up in just 15 minutes?
The question is Ricky Bang here?
Ricky Bang is not here yet, so he's scheduled to be here at 10:30. So we can take a break, come back and see if he's here early, but
Okay.
other than that.
All right. So if
Do we have other business we want to accomplish? Well, we have some permitting stuff.
No problem.
Lindsay, is it okay if we move the,
Stay cool.
Yeah, for sure.
Ryan's ecology update, we've got that placeholder under open forum because we weren't sure what was gonna come down the pike.
I think let's play it by ear and see if Ricky comes early.
Okay.
But yeah, we can be flexible.
Okay, so why don't we take a 15-minute break now and we'll check in 15 minutes and see how nimble we want to be. Okay, so 10:15, please. That's one of the cool things about this room.
Okay.
Yeah. Is Mr. Bang with us or
He is not here
he's
yet.
still en route? Okay. My proposal, Ryan, if you've got some ecology updates, if it's acceptable, I would suggest we move that up. Is that acceptable to the group?
If it's okay with everybody else, I can definitely share a bit. Cool. And actually Jerry's still here, so Jerry could probably add in. So Heart of America, as we've talked about, filed an appeal on the agreed order after the agencies announced it last year, and then we just announced a settlement with between Department of Energy, Ecology, and Heart of America on May 10th. And so and I can share the screen a little bit, but essentially what the settlement does is the settlement does not amend the agreed order, but it provides clarity on orders requirements, and it also includes expert panel review, which I'll go into in a second. And then Jerry, you can feel free to add in anything that I missed. So sorry, I'm trying to track my notes. So the settlement requires Energy to obtain a third-party expert review on a key technical evaluation that's already part of the agreed order. So that's the flexibility evaluation for when Energy is going to be looking at ways to potentially accelerate the retrieval of waste from D109 and T111. And so the one of the requirements under the settlement is that Energy is going to obtain a third-party expert review on this key technical evaluation. That's going to be done by Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And it's going to include an expert from Heart of America Northwest, which I can't recall that name off the top of my head, Jerry.
Dr. Steve Agnew, who has worked for PNNL and others.
All righty, and then so again, and then that key technical evaluation is also, like I said, it's going to explore ways to accelerate waste from, or retrieval of waste from those tanks. And the evaluation will also evaluate near-term options, including enhanced salt well pumping and in-tank pretreatment systems. So the settlement clarifies that the evaluation is going to evaluate and look at those options as well. And then as part of the settlement, we also included some language on our website that provides some clarity on both the leak response plan as well as the practicability evaluation. So I could share that link in chat, and then we will probably also just include it on the HAB happenings. But I'll just say, so the leak response plan, that was due in August of this year. And so the leak response plan is going to be incorporated into the Hanford site-wide permit renewal, which is currently scheduled for early 2024, January, February. So the idea there is that the leak response plan is going to become available in August, and then it's going to be part of the permit. And so folks will be able to review it, provide their comments on it. And then to assist the public in reviewing and providing informed comments on the leak response plan, the public's going to be able to review the results of that separate evaluation. The key evaluation we talked about for accelerating the waste from the tank, the retrieval from the tanks, that's currently due in December. So the goal with having that report available in December is that folks will be able to review it, and then while they're considering comments for the leak response plan in Rev 9. And I didn't say that very well worded, Jerry, but do you have anything I might have missed on that?
Well, what actually would be cool and helpful might be if we put the ecology website up with the explanatory statement. What we developed is in a kind of an explanation of what is a complex schedule, and where the public and the advisory board then can fit in to review the leak response. A, generically, single shell tank leak response plan, and B, a leak response specific evaluation for B109 and T111. The board adopted advice about leak response, saying there should be a leak response plan, and also there should be evaluation of specifics, available equipment and programs that could remove the leakable liquids from T111 and B109. As is readily apparent from the schedule, the generic leak response plan is due in August, and the board should probably be deeply engaged in reviewing that. But although, and what prompted us to file the appeal was an evaluation, you can kind of guess that there was never any feasibility study done of the proposal to use enhanced salt well pumping with or without in-tank cesium removal capsule. That was never studied, and that will only now be studied and reported back on with an evaluation in probably November. So leak response plan generic, August. An evaluation of the specific capability coming in probably November. I'm a little backwards, right? Then feed together for the review, public review and board review of the RCRA permit and its leak response plan in early 2024. So that brings it together. But the board may want to And the committee should certainly, I would hope, be briefed on and want to review the initial leak response plan starting in, when it comes out at the end of August, and be ready to move that, because there may be changes before it goes out to the public that you might want to be able to influence. And then to feed in what is the specific capability of removing leakable liquids from B109 and T111. And the exact same technology that we were just talking about for TSCR in stripping out cesium before it leaves the tank. And so that's the schedule. And Brian's got it up here. And I have to say, you know, it's very helpful having Brian and team and other, you know, a lot of participation trying to say, how do we describe this in an explanatory statement on the ecology website so that people can follow along what these steps are? Because there is a little bit of cart before the horse doing a leak response plan before you have an evaluation of what is likely to be a recommended technology. In fact, was, as the board's prior advice, our advice pointed to, in 2020, there already was an evaluation that said use enhanced salt well pumping as a leak response. So that's the lay of land. And then there is also a review of monitoring requirements for external monitoring of leaks that is coming out, and which you may want to, I would hope, would want to review. How's that?
We have our groupers here.
Yeah.
So calendar. So we have committee meetings scheduled in August and we have a full board meeting scheduled in August. So you guys need to figure out if you can queue up for a tanks committee meeting and then board meeting with this information. It sounds like it's maybe too tight in terms of your deadline.
Yeah, so and it's been kind of been discussed, I know we have a few minutes until the next presentation starts, but we'll cover what we can. And Lindsay, you can probably touch on this for the schedule of HAB meetings, is that they're talking about moving some of the committee meetings from August to September. And then the full board meeting would still be August 23rd, 24th. And again, the leak response plan is due in August 2023. I'm not sure the exact date. And if, you know, so you're right, the time, we would have to look at timing and try and figure that out. But the potential is there if it gets, you know, submitted on time, that we could potentially do a chat with the tanks committee in September, depending on, you know, availability and that kind of stuff. So that could potentially work out.
I'm pretty sure that the leak response plan is due on the 1-year date of the agreed order.
I think you're right.
Like the day would be the board meeting, so that's not gonna.
Yeah, which was like August 25th or 24th.
And Pam, we did talk about it yesterday afternoon while you had gone to the NAS meeting, that we're looking at moving the August meetings to the week of September 12th. So the full board meeting would still be August 23rd and 24th, I believe are the dates. And then the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th would be a full committee week for RAB, tanks, BCC, and the PIC.
Thank you.
Rob?
Normally, yes.
Just displaying my ignorance, the Heart of America Northwest, what organization is that? Is that you?
Heart of America Northwest is the oldest and largest membership Hanford cleanup watchdog group with several thousand members in Oregon and Washington. We were founded in 1987 and convened the Oregon governor's task force on cleanup of Hanford that led to the concept of the 30-year timeline for the tri-party agreement and have been engaged for all that time.
Okay.
Yeah. I've been on the board since, and now Heart America Northwest represented on the board by Amber Waldrop, our board president, who is Spokane County Council member, and Alfonso Contreras.
Where are you guys based out of?
Our office is in Seattle, but like we have 200 members or so in the Tri-Cities, and about 50 members in Walla Walla, and a couple hundred members along the Columbia Gorge. And nice in Spokane, yeah.
So if anybody has any other follow-up questions, we can probably save it for open forum. I know we're at 10:30, so I want to respect the other speakers' times, if that's okay.
Yes, we do have Ricky and his team here, so.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Ricky, would you stand up and introduce yourself and your buddies?
And Ricky, you can stand during your briefing, or you can take a seat around the table, whatever you're most comfortable with.
I kind of enjoy standing just so I can see the room, interact and answer any questions that might come up. But again, my name is Ricky Bang. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy as their Tank Farms Program Division Director. With me today is just some of my employees, Jim Green with Retrievals, Steve Exman with AP Farm, TSCR, Lark ETF, Becky Blackwell, Closure. But we'll mostly focus on presentation today, which will cover the tank side season removal system status updates, as well as an retrieval update. So thanks for allowing me this opportunity to speak today and for running the slide deck. If there are any questions throughout this presentation, briefing, feel free to raise your hand and ask the questions. I think because of the way the slide deck's divided up, best to just ask your question as it comes up in the slide deck.
Okay, so that is kind of contrary to normally we wait until you're finished.
Okay.
And then we have ecology make comments. And then EPA, if they're here, you make comments, and then we get to make comments. So that's
Okay, we'll
normally
do
how
that too.
that's normally how I do it. I appreciate that though, because all the time we have questions.
All right, the next slide then. All right, so again, today the briefing purpose is to cover the tank side season removal updates, as well as where we're at with single shell tank waste retrievals. It's for information only. All right, so before I go in too deep into tank side season removal, which will be the first half of the briefing, just a reminder of what it is and how it fits into the picture of the direct feed low activity waste program. So what's nice about this graphic is there's a nice little arrow that shows where it all starts. Where it all starts is the 53 million gallons of tank waste stored in tank farms. But specifically for our tank waste treatment mission, we start with the tank AP105 that's listed down there. That waste is transferred into tank AP107. This tank here on the graphic is what feeds the tank side cesium removal system. Tank side cesium removal system is one of the center gray blocks with the primary container housing the system. Tank waste is transferred from AP107 through the TSCR system where it pre-treats that tank waste at about 5 gallons per minute. When it's operational, that'll equate to about 7,200 gallons per day. That pre-treated tank waste is then fed into AP106. That's where we store the treated tank waste, where it'll eventually be fed to the waste treatment and immobilization plant. So again, today I'll just focus on the tank side cesium removal system. Okay, next slide. So where we're currently at, where we're headed, I think overall, we kind of had an operational goal of hitting 800,000 gallons processed within the first campaign. We're still on track to hit that. And really, I think that's just a goal that we set for ourselves to be prepared for DF-LAW full operations, which means WTP running with its melters and us feeding the tank waste to the waste treatment plant. So we kind of set the goal of 800,000. I think really I guess the bare minimum that we needed was about 230 gallons, 230,000 gallons. That's kind of what we needed to have staged to be ready for DF law. Our stretch goal is going to be about 800,000 gallons. So we're currently in what we call batch 3. So what a batch is I think actually before I'll get to what a batch is, I will provide a background of how the TSCR system works, and then that'll help explain what the batch is. What we have within TSCR, I'll shine you a little laser on the right side of the system. We have these 2 stainless steel filters. Those filters remove the undissolved solids from the waste stream. So we really don't want any solid material. We really want to run liquid through the ion exchange columns. So we have filters that filter out the solids before the waste gets into the resin columns. We have 3 columns on the left. Those are the resin columns where we remove cesium primarily from the waste stream. Okay, kind of imagine it as kind of a water softener type system. Your water softener is removing those hard solids. This is just removing cesium on a radioactive scale. And so that's kind of how the system works, is that we have filters, 2 filters on the right. And again, the 3 ion exchange resin columns that pull the cesium out of it. And so you kind of imagine that these flow goes from right to left and then back into the tanks. And so what we call a batch is when those 2 of the 3 resin columns have been, I'll just say, full of cesium. So when they pulled out all the cesium that the resin can, and the resin can't remove any more cesium, we'll say, hey, for those 2 out of 3 columns, that completes a batch. So we do have cesium detectors, and typically each column would have about 60 to 70,000 curies, and then that's typically about a full column. 2 full columns, again, a batch. So we currently on the middle batch 3, which means we have 4 full columns. Those 4 columns are sitting on a storage pad just adjacent to the TSCR column. So we have 4 full columns full of cesium currently. And the other bit to note is that we expect to have 5 batches to complete the full campaign of about 800,000 gallons. So that's what we're currently on track for. To date, we've pre-treated 440,000 gallons, on track for that 800,000 gallons. So 440,000 gallons sits in AP 106, ready to transfer to the waste treatment and immobilization plant. What that does equate to is about 218,000 curies of cesium removed. I'll say by that term, it's 218,000 curies in those 4 columns sitting adjacent to the concrete pad. There's some curies that we've removed and are in the resin that's still inside of those columns, but because we're still in the middle of batch 3, we're not taking credit for that just yet. The 4th bullet, I'm going to say that we have observed that the tank size cesium removal system is more efficient than we expected. So we kind of did some modeling work. We had some assumptions about how TSCR would operate based on laboratory testing. We expected 7 batches to get to that 800,000 gallons. And really 7 batches for this current campaign. Based on where we're at right now, we're doing about 180,000 gallons, 190,000 gallons for each batch. So we really only need 5 to finish out that first campaign. So that was a nice surprise, was to see that our processing was more efficient than we expected, which equates to really less downtime for TSCR, less columns needed for this first batch. So that's been a real positive out of this first campaign, at least. And so went through the photo on the left. When I talked about the 4 columns that are sitting on the pad, what the workers have to do at TSCR is pull the columns from the system itself with the forklift. The photo on the right-hand side shows you that forklift and then how the columns are placed in storage on the pads. There are kind of seismic restraints on the concrete pad itself just to hold it tight. There is passive ventilation on the columns as well, but kind of imagine about 2 more columns to the right of these 2 shown in the photo currently. Again, each one holding about 60 to 70,000 curies of primarily cesium in those columns right now. Just sharing a couple of more photos. I think I'll go counterclockwise on these. So I'll start with the top right. We have just a photo of the control room for the tank size cesium removal system. So we have 2 operators working shift. And so they manage, control, oversee the TSCR system, the parameters of that system, and they sit in that little control room monitoring the system day in, day out for operations and maintenance. So that's what they're doing on the top right. On the left side, we have a photo of the workers, again, dressed out in their personal protective equipment as they're kind of watching the removal of that column from the enclosure itself with the forklift. Each one, I think another keynote is that with the resin and with the material inside that tank, it does weigh 27,000 pounds, which is pretty impressive with the amount of material that's still remaining inside that tank. So 27,000 pounds. It's a custom forklift that is used, that we built to remove and install new columns inside the tank size cesium removal system. The lower right photo is just kind of a view of the inside of the enclosure where we house the columns. And so prior to removal, workers do have to enter that unit, disconnect hoses from the columns in order for the forklift to pull that column out of the enclosure. So there are some manual disconnects that do currently occur. Next slide. So that provides the overview status of the tank size cesium removal. So again, we're middle of batch 3, on track to hit batch 5, 800,000 gallons to meet our goals for direct feed low activity waste, or our stretch goal of that 800,000 gallons. Next up, I'll just talk about the retrieval updates. So tank waste retrievals, let's see, where should I start? Overview highlight, we've got 56 million gallons of tank waste stored at the Hanford site in 177 underground storage tanks in 18 different tank farms. There's 7 different types of tank configurations that exist out at Hanford. And one of our, I'll say, I like to think of the tank waste program as having kind of 4 mission objectives. We want to safely store the tank waste. We want to retrieve the tank waste from single shell tanks to double shell tanks. We want to treat the tank waste. Then we want to immobilize and dispose of that tank waste. So with the second objective, retrieving that tank waste, we previously were retrieving in the C tank farm in this graphic up on the upper right. You get the C tank farm. So we completed retrieval activities in C tank farm. And the second farm that we're retrieving now is the AX tank farm, which is in the center southeast quadrant of the tank farm complex. So there are 4 tanks in AX tank farm. We've retrieved AX 102. We're in the paperwork stages of AX 103 and AX 104, following the deployment of 2 technologies in those 2 tanks. And then we're currently retrieving AX 101. I think we've got the first technology deployed in AX 101. I actually just had a transfer yesterday, which was pretty good, about, I'd say roughly 15,000 gallons yesterday, which was pretty nice. So I think the AX 101 is kind of the 4th of 4 tanks that we're retrieving in AX tank farm. And then we do have some construction activities in A tank farm to prepare as the next tank farm to retrieve. I like this photo just because it's the, I'll get to the after photo, but I think it kind of gives you a sense of kind of the retrieval activity that does have to occur. This is a photo of the interior of tank AX101, which is the tank we're retrieving right now. You can kind of see the internals of it with the airless circulators throughout the tank. You can kind of see the retrieval equipment on the left with the arm kind of angling at a 45 degree. I think it's one of our sluicers to help us with tank waste removal. You see a lot of the salt cake that exists on the walls of the tank, the surface of the tank, on top of the airless circulators. The workers out there in the field, the operators, they're doing a really good job of trying to get every last bit of tank waste off the walls and airless circulators for retrievals. But this kind of gives you an idea of where all the waste is. I think we kind of assume it's just all in the tank, but it's all kind of covering the interior of the tank and a lot of the airless circulators and a lot of the equipment that existed in that tank. AX101, fun fact, has about 426,000 gallons in it before we retrieved. That's more than double what AX102, 3, and 4 had combined. So AX101 is like retrieving the previous 3 twice over, right? So that's kind of the amount of work that the current operators have in the field with tackling AX101. They did a really good job with AX102. And I think we're still wrapping up the paperwork for 3 and 4, but we're really looking forward to what the workers out there can do with AX101. Other highlights on this. Let me get to the next slide before I cover anything else. So next slide. So where we're currently at, you can kind of see on the slide deck, the difference with what remains on the walls, what remains on the top of the airless circulators, on the airless circulators, and then the salt cake that was on top. Maybe for dramatic effect, let's go back a slide and forward slide again. So before. So it's been a good difference, and I think it's also been kind of good progress to see because the operators in the field, they really see the progress that they're making as well. We're at about 45% complete with AX101, 45% complete with that last transfer yesterday. Next steps is to do a couple more DST to DST transfers because we're transferring from AX101 to AZ101, and we just need to make some space in AZ101 after yesterday's transfer. And so I think we'll do those transfers sometime this summer. And then, as always, that last 10% is always the hardest to get. So I think it'll take us through FY20 or 2024 to finish up AX101. So just got a couple of different views in the right-hand side, the upper left, and then you can kind of see the sluicing in the lower left side with the mobile arm and kind of the jet spray that occurs as those operators are removing waste off the tank walls. I think that covers those highlights. Next slide. So again, just in summary for the status updates, and then we can get to questions, but tank size season removal, I think is kind of that first step in that tank waste treatment portion of the mission, where we're trying to pre-treat the tank waste before we feed it to the WTP. So far, so good. TSCR's been more efficient than we anticipated. We're on batch 3 of 5, on track to hit kind of our stretch goal for TSCR. And then kind of the first and second phase with our tank farm missions objectives, that retrieval of tank waste from single shell tanks to double shell tanks. I think, we're applying a lot of the lessons learned from C Farm into AX Farm. AX Farm has gone pretty smoothly right now with us getting into the 4th of 4 tanks in AX Farm, and we're making preparations, at least with construction, our infrastructure, utilities in A Farm as well. But with that, I'll at least end the updates and ask that am I at the point to ask for questions?
Sure. Actually,
Let's check in with the college.
Yeah, it's fair.
Jeff, you're on.
You can talk about TSCR first.
I can. TSCR is very, very successful, but as Ricky, I'm sure can tell you, there are some tweaks and things that need to be done in TSCR to make sure everything's working correctly. And I would offer too, that there are conversations about whether or not the 5 gallons per minute are going to suffice over time for supporting fecal activity waste. Do you want to speak to that, Ricky?
I can talk to both as well. I think,
Go ahead.
I think the little tweaks, I think when you go set off to build something first of a kind and deploy it at Hanford, didn't work the way we hoped. Even though it is more efficient, the little details, is really what's getting us, is getting to that 100% quality, I think, is keeping us from actually being even more efficient than what we're achieving. Little things like, making sure every last nut and bolt is tight, making sure that we, have all of our documentation in place, but also incorporating the lessons learned that the workers have. I think what we're learning is, RadCon, IH, the operators, pipe fitters, they're learning as well. And so we're kind of taking their ideas on making improvements to the tank size cesium removal. So little things that can make their lives easier to remove a column, to disconnect those hoses, even to doing maintenance, your fire protection maintenance, electrical maintenance. Those ideas, we're incorporating them in between batches. The second piece, I think, Dan, was, what we need next. So TSCR treats 5 gallons per minute of tank waste. And that's pretty good, but at WTP, operating at its capacity, we'll probably need about 10 gallons per minute. So the next phase will probably need, that additional 5 gallons per minute. We had an independent organization do an analysis of alternatives of what would be preferred for the next phase of this project. I think that was completed just this past April, if I got that right.
Sounds about right. The analysis of alternatives was done specifically to see what capabilities and capacities would be required to support low activity waste over time. What they ended up with, do you want to talk about AMPS?
Yeah, so I like talking about AMPS. I love the acronym, actually. So we have TSCR, tank size cesium removal. The next phase of it, I think we'd like to call the Advanced Modular Pretreatment System, or AMPS.
So you're going to amp it up.
It's got a nice ring to it. I didn't make up the acronym. Credit to our federal project director for coming up with that acronym. But it kind of has a good flow to it. The analysis of alternatives looked at everything from the original low activity waste pretreatment system, modified low activity waste pretreatment system, to an additional TSCR unit, to kind of a improved version of the TSCR unit. It looked at different configurations as well. So for example, I showed the 2 filter system with the 3 columns. It looked at 4 columns, 5 columns. It looked at bigger columns. What the independent team then concluded was to evaluate the actions needed to extend the current TSCR system for continued operations. And it recommended either 2 or 3 additional advanced modular pretreatment systems. So a TSCR plus 2 or 3 advanced modular pretreatment systems. That is an evaluation that would still have to be done, given the assumptions that the team used for WTPs. So the next phase is to go through conceptual design to kind of flush out those details. And then really, I think it'll take about at least a year to develop conceptual design far enough along to understand what AMPS will look and be like.
Essentially, a couple of items. AMPS 1, you can look at it as a TSCR on steroids, if you will. Same processing control strategy, at least in concept, It's just better capability and better throughput. The other thing too that I took out of the AOA was the idea that AMPS is nimble. It can be used in a variety of configurations. It can be fielded more than one place if absolutely necessary. One of the thoughts at this particular point is to house it close to the existing TSCR, such that the two of them can work in concert to ensure support for low activity waste throughput. So all of those things are in process. Ecology has permitted the initial TSCR configuration. That permit is in the books, if you will. The rest of the things that Ricky is talking about are in process. We have not been approached at this point with any formal permitting media to support the upgrade to the AMPS configuration. That is in the offing. I don't know if, Ricky, you can provide any schedules on that. I've not seen any at this point.
No, and we're still working through those because the AOA team just came up with their recommendation. And so we're still working the process of the schedule, timeline for conceptual design.
Okay.
And once we get to the end of conceptual design, I think that'll inform both the permitting and the future timeline.
Okay, and that's what I know about that. Jeff?
I'm Jeff Lyon with Ecology, and I oversee the retrieval processes that are going on, and I really can't add much more to what Ricky has said. They are doing really well, and credit due there where the workers have been doing an excellent job retrieving. They have a rule that they need to try at least, they need to retrieve the maximum extent that they can, retrieve the tank to the maximum extent that they can. And we stipulated that there would be 3 different technologies that they could use. And like Ricky pointed out, a couple of them used 2 technologies, and that was all that was necessary to get as much out of waste out of the tank. So that's helpful to know that we don't have to keep putting in new technologies to get more and more waste out. That saves a lot of time and work. And the thing I want to point out is one of my favorite subjects is the DST space. Ricky pointed out that they have to do multiple transfers and the space is limited at DSTs. And so it has impacts on retrievals. Minimum tank space impacts retrievals. And there's going to be time in the future where that's going to hinder retrievals of the tanks. And that's common knowledge for all of us that we only have so many tanks and it's limiting on how much waste you can retrieve. And this is a big circle of continuity of operations, I guess. You got to have the right amount of tank waste coming out of the tanks, SSTs, and putting it into the DSTs, and then have the DSTs to make sure TSCR and everything is running, and then make sure that there's enough TSCR waste to keep the plant running. So it's a real complex system, and I compliment them for the way and effort that they've been making to really plan that. And so, yeah, I think that's about all I would. It seemed like there was one more thought, but I can't remember what it was. So I would like to be on the queue to ask a couple of questions too. So
I can do that. So I've got Tom, Ham, Rob, and Jeff. Oh, and Mia.
Thank you so much for the presentation, really informative. TSCR campaign 3 is ongoing now, so there's active treatment happening. And how long is that campaign expected to run?
So right now we've paused batch 3. I think we've been paused for about a month now. There's some treated waste seeping from one of the connections. And so we paused operations. We blew it down, workers entered, they tightened the connection. And I think we're on track to restart batch 3 next weekend. Not this coming weekend, but the following one. A typical campaign treatment to fill out the 2 columns will take about a month. And then there's typically about a month of maintenance time. And then if you hit the right cycle of all the maintenance coming due, it could take about 2 months for maintenance. Because between batches 1 and 2, we had other leaks that we repaired, some nuclear safety documentation to update. We had extended outages to those, while we also incorporated some equipment upgrades and procedure updates that the workers provided.
And so the contamination from those leaks is limited in scope and stuck and inside the secondary containment of the trailer, or is it out?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think the latest one the ones we had were drips. The latest one we had, we kind of struggled to call a leak, but we called it a leak. But it was basically seeping from the connection. It never tripped an alarm, and it never made it to the secondary containment. But just out of conservative, for safety of the equipment and operations, we just paused it, put it into safe configuration and tightened connections. But the workers caught it visually, and now I think the next steps are, we're working with ecology to kind of help us define those parameters for a leak. Because in nuclear safety space, we could have continued to operate, but just out of conservatism, we decided to pause. Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I do know that a presentation is in the offing where all of this information will be presented to us, so we'll get a better idea of what's going on. I would have to echo what Ricky says about that. It would be difficult, based on what I've seen, the pictures and stuff, and our folks being out there, it would be difficult to call this latest one a leak. Realistically, a seep, I think, is more appropriate. I don't remember in any of the pictures seeing anything drip any distance at all. Thank you.
All right, so we've got 5 people in queue, so we'll go Pam and then Rob and keep going. Pam?
Okay, I have 3 simple questions. So you're talking about these modular systems being expanded. At one point in time, and probably back when Kevin was the director of ORP, there was a facility plan to do this pretreatment, which seems more secure to me, but it sounds like you're not looking at a bricks and mortar facility, you're going to continue to do modular.
The analysis of alternatives recommended the modular system, like tank size easing removal. It's been proven, more efficient and more cost efficient.
Okay, so next question, ecology has never been willing to budge in terms of reuse of a single shell tank, but in looking at AX 101, that looks pretty darn clear. And if you need tank space, will you consider requesting the opportunity to reuse a single shell tank?
I don't know if I could answer that one, but I don't think it's a RCRA compliant method for that. Jeff, that's my
I wasn't
understanding.
clear. I think you asked about using SSTs for waste storage.
Waste has been treated and is ready to go to HLW. I mean, the low activity facility. If you need a place to put the pre-treated waste, would you consider that?
There's nobody in my office that would ever consider that.
That's what
I
I'm
can tell you.
hearing.
So
Darn.
those are not compliant tanks, and we don't.
Okay. And I asked a question of the previous speaker about the columns that you have shown us. And is it your understanding that those are going to HLW at some point in time?
I think so. I think what we have is System Plan 9. In the Hanford System Plan 9, we've done that analysis, and it says that we have looked at a variety of alternatives for where the cesium and that resin would go. And I think one of the highest alternatives was for it to go to the high level waste facility.
Thank you very much. That's it.
Right. Rob, you're next. Jeff, you're on deck. Rob?
When you use the term, the tank retrieval, well, what's your criteria for determining that that tank has been retrieved?
Okay, so, boy, that gets into the details. I think the 2 criteria I do know is we have to deploy at least 2 technologies up, and there is a decision criteria for deployment of a 3rd technology. The other criteria that we would have to hit and defend is the volume that still remains in the tank. And so following deployment of 2 technologies, we do go in and sample any remaining residual waste that exists. We also do some laser scanning of the tank to understand how much residual volume still remains in that tank. The tri-party agreement says less than 360 cubic feet, or to the extent that 2 technologies have been deployed. And then there's the paperwork process to do the evaluation of the deployment of the tank.
Okay. Do you look at total or any liquid volume that is left, I guess?
Yeah, liquid and solid volume, okay, that would be left. And then some of the criteria looks at the impacts to the tank waste, and then really downstream treatment. If we deploy the third technology, we look at work and safety to both the environment and the worker in our evaluation, in the decision on a third technology or if it's complete.
Okay. Another question, how are you prioritizing what tanks you are looking to retrieve with the TSCR system?
So for single shell tank retrievals, I think I would kind of start with our system planning, to a large extent is, we have in a tri-party agreement, a milestone to work with ecology on our system plan. That system plan looks at the life cycle of the mission, and it kind of describes the order with which we'll retrieve the single shell tanks. So I think before my time, we agreed to CFARM, A&AX. It was a complex that had, a good amount of the radioactivity and the risk in the single shell tanks, but also close to the infrastructure that existed in the southeast quadrant. And so through the system planning efforts with ecology, I think that's how at least DOE came to the decision on the order of tanks we will retrieve. And I think on both your questions, it would be fair to give Jeff and Dan.
What I would offer as far as the system planning is concerned, each of the system plan has different assumption sets and different criteria by which both waste treatment and retrievals occur. Based on those criteria and assumption sets, the order of retrievals is considered. Now, either party, Department of Energy or Ecology, has the right, and I'll use something that's going on with the AO as an example, to say, I want this set of tanks before that set of tanks. Show me what that. Using the AO as an example with B109 and T111, those two are inserted as a matter of priority over others. So when those two are inserted, the order of retrievals may change. The date of retrievals may change. The sequencing long-term may change. It's all based on, in the system plan, a set of criteria and assumptions that are built into the model runs, what we call model runs. And the output of that gives you sequencing and it gives you dates. Depending on what it is you're looking for, you would have to go into the variety of alternatives in the system plan. And throughout the system plan, what you see are a variety of graphs. And if you look very carefully, you'll see tank numbers on those. And what that is based on the output of the assumption set and criteria and the model run. You will see a suggested sequence of retrievals. And it's different for each of the alternatives considered.
Okay, where in the prioritization does a leaking tank end up?
I'll use the AO again as an example, and Jerry, follow on me if I miss anything. In this particular case, the AO talked to a variety of things that needed to be considered, one of which was acceleration of retrievals for B109 and T111 because of the potential problems associated with leaks. So that criteria all of a sudden raised itself in terms of priority. And that is now inserted into the model runs for System Plan 10. We're not anywhere done, but that criteria has now raised itself in terms of priority. And it's been inserted into some of the model runs for System Plan 10 to see what the output and the sequencing now would end up being.
But if I can add, so ecology asked for an alternative to do that for the B and T tank farms with leaks are, I think it was alternative 9 or 19, I forget which one. Otherwise, because they're behind, the B farm and T farm were scheduled at best for 2050. I believe B farm is 2050 to be given retrieval. And moving it up, forward, someone's bedroom. Moving it up in this sequence, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the fastest start for B farm, despite the leak, would be 2035 for the B farm to start in this retrieval sequence. which would mean, leakage at the current rate of like 6,000 gallons more into the soil before it even started bee farm. So it's not like tank leak, it jumps to the head of the line under this system. And I don't, it's not my system. That's a good question.
Each of the alternatives, as I say, have different criteria sets and assumptions. Now, to Jerry's point, I don't know for sure what the system plan is now saying about which date is going to be assigned to the bee farm and the tea farm. Help me, Jeff, on this, but if I'm correct, what I do remember is that during the assignment of B and T farm, B109 and T111 are the first ones to be looked at. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, I got some
Jim?
stuff to say too, so.
You do? Okay.
Jim
And
wants to.
Jim wants to.
One of the things I want for perspective is the reason we did C farm and ANAX is they're close to these double cell tanks. And so we could install the hose transfer lines to get there because none of the transfer lines that were used to be used for the single shell tanks can be used now. They've either plugged or they were single or double contained stuff. So one of the problems with being farm and T farm is they're way out there, a long ways away from any double shell tanks. Right, so that complicates it. If we're going to use transfer lines to get the waste moved out of T111 or B109 to get it there, then there's a huge expense with getting those transfer lines installed. I think the next likely place we're moving is SXX because that's what we're near SY farms where there's double shell tanks so they can keep doing some stuff. But the infrastructure required to do the single shell tank retrievals is complicated.
Well, I think, part of the question and the concern, really, I think the concern that you're sharing is, you've got, potentially, if you have a leaking tank, how would you respond? And I think, when I answered your second question, I just gave you, hey, we've planned priority tanks based on our system plan. But I think your follow-up question is, you're sharing a concern that if there is a leaking tank, how would that impact our system plan? Now, with B109, T111, or any future potentially leaking tanks, if we do see indications of one, we have a extensive process where we've monitored the liquid level in that tank. So, and we're monitoring the levels, and then when we have enough indication that there's a potential for a leak, there's an evaluation of the response actions that we will take to that leak. And so, based on the evaluations done, the potential options that we could deploy to address that risk. And I don't want to minimize the risk or even say that's difficult to retrieve the tanks, because if there is a risk, then we would have to take the appropriate action. And I think if you look at B109, the T111, the risk in B and T complex was contained. There are historical risks that existed in B and T complex prior to the leaks with these most recent leaks. And there are controls in place that existed with both the monitoring and the groundwater treatment that existed in that area. So you kind of have to look at the big picture of how this fits into the Hanford tank waste mission, or even the Hanford mission of reducing the risk at the site. And where it would then fit into the priorities is that you look at the risk of a leaking tank and then where it fits. Because we have taken actions to immediately retrieve certain tanks that have leaked before. And then between B109, T111, there were the discussions, the evaluation to say the controls in place are still in place. And then we're doing the system planning now and those discussions to see where it would fall out next. I don't know if that helped, because it is a legitimate concern, but it's a complicated subject to completely walk through.
And that I'm sure of, that I understand that. But you're talking, when you're comparing, you mentioned cost of changing the plan versus the environmental risk.
I'm talking the risk as well, right? So the risk of the radionuclides that exist in tank farms, the amount in an AX farm compared to B and T farm or S, SX and U farm, the risk exists in A and AX farm.
But it's not leaking. But it.
Not today.
But they aren't leaking.
But what we need to address though is the risk to the Hanford as a whole, right? So you've got the leaking tank, but if it's less than 1% of the total inventory, but you've got A&AX with 15% of the inventory, what do you tackle? You tackle immobilizing the risk that you can address, 15% or the less than one. And I'm not gonna tell you what the right answer is. I don't know what the right answer is, but you know, it is a complicated subject.
I'd like to add just some more information. In D105 was a leaking tank. It was it's estimated leak volume was 111,000 gallons. It's diagonally from 101. I think D109 has got 13,000 gallons of assumed liquid in there. But then the BXBY complex, it was over 300,000 gallons estimated. So I'm not saying we should just allow leaks to go on, but we are already out to do long-term stuff in terms of barrier, groundwater, whatever, we're going to treat those past leaks as well. So yeah, there's no perfect, but you know, we can't just focus really close on each one individual thing. But on the other hand, we've had 2 tanks now declared leaking, and we're a long ways from getting the rest of the tanks retreated, so we could have more in the future. So we do need to be more nimble in the future to do responses.
Yeah, I guess I would think that in your risk evaluation, even though there's a much more volume in your A-side tank area there, that.
Not just one, but the radionuclides of concern. Your tech and item, right?
Higher contamination.
Exactly.
So-
It all exists in that southern quadrant.
Okay, so the amount of contamination in those tanks versus the leaking tanks, the leaking tanks have a lot lower contamination levels. Is that what you're saying?
The leaking tanks do have, I think my numbers were like 2 orders of magnitude less tech and iodine than, you know, AX, S, XX, and V forms.
Just an
Now, right or wrong, that those are just, that's just the data.
So let me give you a time check. We've got about 15 minutes more left. I've got 5 people in queue. There are almost as many people online listening in as the ones you can see in the room. So and yet Larry's waving at us.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we're getting into that.
Yeah, and that's okay. Just I guess that so people understand that you do have a prioritization process that does consider the leaking tanks.
It does.
And I'm okay with that. One last question, real quick. What's the general rad levels of the tank, your TSCR tanks?
Columns?
Oh,
When they're full?
columns,
Yeah.
60 to 70,000 curies is what's stored inside.
Okay. What's the rad levels at 3 feet?
Oh,
No, by
milligrams.
Oh, okay, that's all.
Yeah.
They're in shielded containers.
Yeah, shielded.
They're shielded
Okay.
containers. Yeah.
I'm done.
But it's,
Right.
but
I just have a question. I think, since I've been overseeing retrievals for a long time, I would like to answer your question from my perspective. Everybody gave you theirs. We have a system plan that does sequence the tanks. That's the way we've always done it. Back in the day, they used to pick the high-risk tanks, which would be the ones that have the most potential to contaminate groundwater. And they were cherry picking, and they realized really quickly, like Jim pointed out, infrastructure is going to be a real problem. And so then they started to go to tank farms. So then we start picking tank farms, and they were in seed farm. That's why we ended up with seed. Then we go to system plan now, and we start planting tanks. And ANAX was chosen because it's right there next to a DST. It's cheap and easy to retrieve. And that's really the only reason, although they have really, it was good to get that waste out of those tanks. And then you bring in the leaking tank problem. It's good for this forum to be talking about how you're going to evaluate risk when you think about retrieving things. The state doesn't have that criteria right now. We have, if it's leaking to the environment, you have to stop it. So that's the approach that we went with the agreed order, and that's why you're seeing these evaluations that are coming about from the agreed order. It's how are you going to get the waste out of these tanks when they're in the middle of nowhere? There's no infrastructure, and there might be good ways of doing that, like it might be low rad stuff you can haul, you know, but that's what this evaluation is gonna look at, is the various, and Jerry spoke about another alternative way of taking waste out of the leaking tanks and getting them into something different. And, you know, in the state's mind, we set a goal to retrieve all the tanks. So, you know, which one is high risk, which one was low risk, it's just get all the waste out of the tanks, and that's the way we've been working up until the leaking tank problem became. And so it's been my goal to get infrastructure so that they can retrieve leaking tanks. And that's part of what this evaluation is going to do. And that's part of what System Plan 10 is doing, is they're evaluating the cost and how we would complete the whole mission and consider some alternative scenarios where we can say, how do you get waste out of these tanks? Or how do you prepare to get waste out of these tanks? And so for me, you know, the simple answer is System Plan picks tanks. When they started leaking, then it changes the game. We have to figure out how to start doing that, and that's infrastructure problems. Last thing I want to say is there's 20 tanks out there, SSTs, that have already leaked. And so they have holes in the bottom of them, basically. The unique thing about B109 is it didn't leak before. So this is the first tank that was not identified as a leaking tank that started to leak. And I think that's really important for people to think about, because we're talking about a mission that could go, you know, depending on which scenario you pick, 2070 to 2170. And you're gonna have this waste sitting in SSTs for 50 to 100 more years, and they've been in it for 70 to 100 years already. And I want to go back to my point. B109 is the first tank that's ever started leaking that didn't leak before. So that's a really big deal. And I think that's an important thing for, you know, policy wise, and to think about. When we start looking at the mission, it's really important to treat the waste. It is. And so how do you balance these things? That's what I wanted to say about that.
Okay.
And then I do have two questions.
That's right. You're
Jeff,
next,
before-
and Mia, you're on deck.
Before we move back into questions, it seems like the committee has a lot of energy on this topic, and there's 10 minutes left, and how many people in queue? You said 5 folks in queue. And so maybe this is something that, you know, we bring forward to a future tank waste committee meeting. I talked with Ricky after the meeting and see when it's appropriate to come back, and the group can help frame some questions that he can speak to. So, we're using our time more efficiently.
It might be good to couple it potentially with the leaky, if we do a topic on the leak response plan.
Yeah.
Assuming that's in August, so, you know, potential September future, that could be a good idea to couple those together potentially.
Yeah,
I agree.
I was thinking that too, Ryan. I think that's a good time.
So Ruth, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, so 5 people in queue. Mia, you're on
I
deck.
still have my questions.
That's right. Yeah,
I was on
you're
queue.
next. You're right here. Yes.
And I did want to ask, I noticed the workers were really close to the cesium columns. You know, it was like within, in my estimate, 8 feet. So is there exposure? Could you talk a little bit about worker exposure and what that means?
Let's see.
Loading a column?
Yeah, when they are next to the column, there is some exposure, but it is, doesn't exceed any worker limits. So the container is shielded from anything that they would typically be exposed to. Actually, this was, unfilled column, so I think if you go to the slide 5.
That was the one that happened right there.
Really, this is as they're disconnecting hoses. They're just in that PPE in case there's any residual waste left in the hose. But if you go back to then the slide 4, you'll see these are fill columns and they're standing right next to it. So at the container area, they're in a buffer area, but not in a contaminated area.
So that's, for me, I want to highlight that again. To me, it's always amazing that they can have that much radioactivity in a column and people can be right next to it. That's pretty cool. That's good engineering, you know, that's awesome stuff. But the fact is, when you retrieve tanks, they pull stuff out of the tanks, and workers get rad doses all the time. And so that's just an important thing for just everybody. I always like to keep reminding myself of that people are getting exposed all the time to get this waste out of these tanks. It might be a little bit, it might be below standards, but they do have maximums that they can get, and they do sometimes get close to those maximums. That was why I wanted to ask, because I thought it was pretty cool. And then the last one I wanted to ask was the amps. What makes it more efficient? What did you do? Did you put better resin in it, bigger tanks?
I think the current concept that we'll explore is a fourth column. With the fourth column, you then load the first three, there's less downtime, but also the lessons learned. And so just with the instrumentation, the equipment, these connections that we're making, even some of the nuclear safety equipment that we would have in it, I think we're looking to make those improvements based on what we've learned from the first 2.5 batches. So I think those are primarily the primary differences at this time.
Okay. And then my last comment, and I'll sit down. When we were talking about TSCRs, and I told you there was one thing I couldn't remember, the thing that's happening with the TSCR units is they're taking the DST space to use that. And he talked about 2 tanks where it's sole feed, sole storage. So they have to pump all the waste out of the DST to get it ready to hold clean waste. And so when you talk about TSCRs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're talking about subtracting DSTs from your storage system. When you subtract DSTs from your storage system, you slow down retrievals. And so it's a really, really fine balance. System plan looks at it, does a good job of it, but I just want to highlight TSCRs take away DST space. That's kind of particular things.
All right, so I've got Mia, Jerry, Rob, Tom, and you got 6 minutes. So if you're at the front end, remember there's somebody at the back end. Mia?
My first question is, why was the decision made to use TSCR and a stick for phase 2 of TBI instead of building on the improvements that have been learned through the TSCR startup and the AMP system that's coming next and all that?
I think, that's a good question. I think that TBI, pump on a stick to be deployed in SY101, it just had minimal infrastructure needed for that, quick deployment in SY101, cost-effective for a demonstration within the scope of an RD&D permit. I think probably the other factor to consider is when you build a significant AMPS project, the cost would have been 4 or 5 times more, and then the permitting, I think you'd have to go into a full RECRA permit than the RD&D permit. That's kind of my initial response.
Okay, thanks. And my second question is I was wondering if you could talk about the pipeline integrity, the waste transfer lines, specifically in AP Farm, where it was reported that moisture was found in the waste transfer line encasements.
Okay, quick status. I think we've, inspected all the annuluses, did the UT testing of the annulus. It's been completed. There are no punctures, no holes in the annulus lines within AP Farm. Next step is to dry out the lines, which they are doing right now. So based on the inspections in AP Farm, I was out there yesterday and they are backfilling the pipes that we exposed in those valve pits. And all that's left is there are 2 things left: primary line UT and hydro testing of those lines. So once those are done, I think we can return those lines back to service. I think we're targeting this fall to have that ready.
But was the reason for the moisture has it been discovered yet, or are you, because you're still doing testing, you don't know?
To my knowledge, we don't know the source of the intrusion yet. Could have been condensation within the pipeline. It could have entered from other openings that exist elsewhere on the entirety of the pipeline, but I don't think we have the source yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I've got Jerry, Rob, and Tom. The question to the group and you, Lindsay, is can we finish these last 3 questions and go into open forum? I don't know what your timing is.
Good until 12.
Okay, I'm thinking if we go 5 or 10 minutes into open forum, is that all right?
If you've got the time available to
Yeah,
support your question.
Okay, so we're gonna go Jerry, Rob, and Tom, and I'm not gonna add extra to the queue, okay? So, Jerry.
Well, Jeff actually asked, one of my questions was about the picture with the workers in the dose, and I was going to ask if you could share an internal diagram to show how the columns
Or shielded.
shielded, yeah.
I'll have to take that as an action.
Yeah, because it occurred to me, it seemed misleading because you're talking about this huge amount of cesium in there and people standing right there. So thanks, Jeff, for asking that already. The second one on the picture is you talked about secondary containment for leaks, but there's something raised before, and in the photograph, it doesn't look like there's any secondary containment when you look straight in the at the open TSCR unit for where the columns are. So what's the secondary containment?
Is it the enclosure itself, Dan? Do you remember?
It should.
And there's the grates along the bottom.
Yeah, that's
Enclosure.
where I was gonna go, yeah.
Oh, so there are,
Yeah.
there's, okay, great, thanks. And then the other thing, rather than have a discussion about it, I would, if we're doing a future briefing, 2 years ago, my summer law students gave a briefing on B109, and we can share that with community members. I mean, there are some different views about whether or not there's an environmental risk and what the risk is. For example, the gamma borehole monitoring around B109 that confirmed that it was leaking showed that the waste contamination is about a third of the way to, is April 2021, third of the way to groundwater roughly. And if you were to pull up some of that dirt from under the tank and sit on it for 6 months, you can receive a fatal dose. So it's not insignificant risk. And there was the whole point of the leak response plan is different than retrieval. I just want to know. Retrieval is the full retrieval that you were showing, right? But the leak response plan is short of that. Can you pull out leakable liquids or something else that stops the leak? The current plan was to do nothing until you retrieve the tank. And so we can share, I'd like to, reshare those slides.
And we could probably share the data that we've collected as well.
I've got Rob and Tom to wrap this up. Rob?
Okay, first of all, thanks a lot. I mean, this is a great presentation. I'd like to remind the folks that came with you, could you guys make sure you sign in on our card?
Oh, is that?
Yeah, it's over by, grab a cookie at the same time.
Sold.
Yeah.
Sign whatever you want.
Yeah, we like to keep track. So, I have a bunch of questions, but I'll limit it down to, right now, the current topic is, what do we do with all this water? Okay, and we're generating a lot of water in our retrievals. And we're then transferring them. And then could you describe that process of what happens next and how we get that water out? Does it go to the evaporator or? And then the follow on is how many gallons, I know that your transfers to WTP or the DFLA are going to be batch transfers. Okay, and so how big is your batch volume? And because I know you're going to get a huge amount, like 5,000 gallons of wash water back,
right,
to flush the lines. And so again, with our context of the SLAW and FFC and that, what are we doing with the water?
That's a really good question. I like you. Yeah. So at least with the water for retrievals, it is in the double shell tank, in the double shell tanks. So a couple of things you could do, but you have to think about the whole big picture of managing tank volume. So you could run it through the evaporator and concentrate that waste. But TSCR actually runs at a lower, molarity, with its cesium. So that water almost balances out just kind of right for the ion exchange resin that we kind of have. The melters, end up being a little less efficient in that case. So that's kind of this balance that you have between TSCR and WTP melters, is that actually the water almost helps that pH and molarity with TSCR, but then the melter is less efficient. But then on the WTP side, they had the EMF facility, the effluent management facility on the back end to also manage that water that exists in the low activity waste facility. So prior to WTP transferring some of that wastewater back, they can run it through EMF, or we can also receive it and then process it through the evaporator. But big picture story is very complicated because then you have to look at, as you supernate or water to retrieve those other tanks. So recycling,
Okay.
Water supernate also makes a lot of sense, but I like your question. There's just not enough time. I think to go into the details. That's
Okay.
a very, very good one.
Okay, and then my last observation is it's sad that we've got to the point where we've got a leaky tank and we can't do anything about it. And that's just really unfortunate because it's facing us with having to measure the risk of future risk in the ground and what it's gonna do versus risk in the tank that's not leaking. You know, a tank that's not leaking does not create the same risk as a tank as a leak. So I don't know why we would equate those two. You know, so, and I granted that we've got our big plan and system plan, and that's gonna help direct us on the selection of the tanks that are gonna be retrieved next. But it'd really be interesting when we get the leak response plan to find out what exactly what it's gonna be, and is ecology gonna be happy with that response? Because, yes. And that's about it. Don't forget to sign, get it.
That's right. Okay, Tom, you get the last question in this group.
I'll be fast. So just a thought for the next conversation we have, because we don't have time here. When, at some point, the only waste left in tanks is gonna be in leaking tanks. No matter, even if no more tanks leak, because you'll have retrieved all the competent tanks. Where are we on dry mining? Because it seems like all the retrieval methods need pressure washers, and you don't want to pressure wash into a hole. So that's for later to talk about. Is TSCR West an option still? Is that still on the board?
TSCR West.
So cross-site transfer of treated waste as opposed to.
We have a project now that's evaluating in AMPS or TSCR like in the west area. Also evaluating the recommissioning of the cross-site super.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Ricky, thank you very much for you and your crew here.
Can I ask you about the cookies?
Actually, there's more than one flavor. You have a choice.
Yes.
Excellent.
And we wish you all the success in the future and want to see you back as soon as possible.
Me too. I'm just representing a lot of hard work by the folks out the side. So happy to at least share what they've been doing.
Thank you for staying a few minutes longer than anticipated.
Thank you, Ricky.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to have some open forum coming up. People want to stand and stretch for a second and then sit right back down? We can do that.
Do you want the thing up?
Yes, I would love it.
Okay, so you guys stand up and I'll figure this out.
I can. Okay, a couple things happening is tomorrow, there's a scheduling meeting where we're gonna go through the HAB work plan for next year. Okay, and so anyway, in preparation for it, I polled a number of folks here in the room, in the committee and et cetera. And I asked for some ideas of what because of the difficulty in aligning people that get presenting to us, we can't come up with subjects just immediately and say, hey, next meeting we want to have it. We got to plan it. And we have to give Lindsay enough time to talk to her people to make sure that she can have people here with the right kind of information that we want to have. So after polling a number of people, I condensed it and rewrote it and that sort of thing. And so up on the list here, I have, and if we could enlarge that, possibly.
If I make it any bigger, you're actually gonna lose. See how far
I
it's.
should be able to pop it out too.
Pardon?
Pop it out.
Like a slideshow.
Here, I see it.
It's really nice to have a comms guy.
So I condensed it down into maybe 6 little paragraphs here. Thinking that on our fiscal year work plan information, we are planning to meet with our tank waste committee 4 times next year. And in those 4 times, we probably have the room for a couple presentations in each meeting. So, I put this together. Let me read the first one here. And a lot of this is from other people and discussions with other folks. There are a couple ads that I know, but one of the things we do is we need more information on the ground. We need to understand some of the performance factors. We need to know why knowledge maturity, I mean, what, if it wasn't good enough in 1986, why is it good enough in 2025? What is the difference in the ground? How did it mature? How did the technology mature? We need a description of the different blends. We need to make sure, I believe, a presentation on the idea of how they would tailor a grout blend to a specific type of waste coming from the site. Remember, the site has tanks and has different classifications for at least 3 major classifications: envelope A, B, and C. And envelope D is I think being blended out now. But also in the same way is how do we guarantee the grout quality, the safety in actually creating, and the safety in the facilities, the regulation of a private company, and the final thought, can grout performance meet the federal regulations? And I think that is a very, very big discussion point that we should further. There also, the second paragraph was this analysis of alternatives. I think we need to really take a look at this from that standpoint and look at the progression of the test bed initiative and look at a programmatic approach. What kind of data are they going to get? How is it going to make a difference? And a better description of understanding how the S-law can fit into the grout conversation. The third one is tank integrity. That has been one of our big things for years and years is getting a read on tank integrity. Some of our first advice from the committee here is we wanted more inspections. We wanted 5-year repeat cycles on some of the double shell tanks. All of that went into advice and discussions in the past. And so pretty routinely, we get updated on some of the latest technologies in that. Well, in the last presentation we had, we noticed that there was 2 critical areas. One was the spalling of the concrete from the top of some of the tanks and the exposed reinforcement bar that was shown in the pictures. And then the other one was the under deposit cracking on the bottom of the vessels. And so now that we're looking at an extension of another 50 years for the life on some of these tanks, I think that we'd really like to take a look at this, the tank integrity from the standpoint of how we're doing, take a look at it from the standpoint of what are we looking at for failure frequencies and things of that sort. I mean, this also brings into a discussion of maybe future infrastructure and retrieval technology. We talked a little bit about hose and hose transfer. We talked some in the past about the modular amp systems now and that. So we'd like a discussion about what they're gonna have to do for the infrastructure to get the West Farms cleaned up. That we're also worried about orphan waste. Certainly the TSCR processing and projected volumes of the TSCR. And then the long-term plan for the CST, or that crystalline silicon titanate. And what kind of research is going to have to be necessary to show that it is not an orphan waste and it can be fed into our high-level waste melter. The last one on the list here was a presentation of the holistic negotiations and a generic plan for the single shell tanks, the leak response plan, is going to be due coming in August. And it's important because it will eventually be incorporated into the site-wide permit. But it's also important from the standpoint that I think that we need to have some input and look at it, provide that public, the public support for it if we go ahead. And then an added list here is a kind of one other thing is I really think that we need a tutorial on the Phoenix program, because I know there's a lot of questions that we ask here, like what's the inventory in these tanks? How much is the volume? How many tanks are leaking? What is this? What is that? Well, if you go to the Phoenix program and you use the right input, you can get a lot of that information displayed. You can get the plumes, the tritium plume and the chromium plumes shown up on a site map. And I just see that as being really helpful, especially to new people on the board, is to have a tutorial on the Phoenix. So each one of these are really open for discussion, and I've not really attached to too many of them. The tank integrity is probably the most important thing for me. But I would entertain if somebody wants to scratch one and think it's not this year, be next one, or if other people got other ideas, but try to remember that we can only have, we're only gonna meet 4 times, and the maximum presentations, I think, is about 8. And the other thing is that Lindsay asked that when we look at these ideas for discussion points at our next meetings, also think of like what kind of advice actionable advice that we could develop in the areas of each of these presentations. Is there an advice point that we want to make? And I think that in some of them really fit. Yes, we can make some advice points, and others, yeah. And I think it's open for discussion. Somebody want to talk?
Hey, Rob, can I just offer a quick clarification on your last paragraph? It says presentation, holistic negotiations, and then it mentions the leak response plan. I just want to distinguish the two. Holistic negotiations, that conceptual agreement announcement was separate from the AO and the associated leak response plan. The announcements went out within about a week of each other, which is really confusing. I do agree, but holistic negotiations, that's separate from the agreed order and the leak response plan that's going to be coming out in August. So I just want to make sure that folks knew that distinction between the two.
Okay. Sure. The holistic negotiations is such a cloud to me. You know, it's like a fog. I don't know what's in there and what's not. I know what I want to be in there, but you know, and anytime we can get, I know that Brian had mentioned that this next year we're going to learn a lot more about holistic.
Could you tell us what has to happen before we can be briefed? Does it have to go to the federal judge in relation to the consent decree?
The agencies, the lawyers, they're currently drafting up the proposed modifications to the CPA and the consent decree. So so we announced the conceptual agreement, back in May. And so now they're currently drafting that agreement. So once that's drafted, then a public notice and associated public involvement will begin on it.
And yeah, at that point, then we'll bring it.
Yeah, at that point, we'll definitely be bringing that.
Yeah, but the timing is just so unknown right now. It's not
Exactly.
something that can be committed to.
Yeah.
Now, would that be better suited for the main board,
Yeah.
that kind of
For the
discussion.
for the full board.
I would guess that that'd be a full board thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in it, I think, across committees, so the full board would be the appropriate place to bring that.
Yeah, at least to start, yeah.
Okay,
So
But again, the timing is just so unknown on that.
Yeah.
The thing I would say, and I understand your timing, is that there is gonna be parts of that that will be interest to the tank committee specifically that won't be interesting to the full board. And, you know, this committee is a lot more dedicated to the whys than the full board, for instance, so I'm positive that we will be interested in the whys and the, for instance. And so that might be something to be cognizant, if you could leave some holes, that could be filled when we can.
Yeah, similar to the agreed order, when we announced the agreed order, I would hazard a guess, and this is just hazarding a guess, that we would do a general presentation to the full board, and then the committees could, you know, maybe do something a little more specific.
Yeah, all right.
Right.
Yeah.
And Rob, when we talked about your list of topics, one of the items or one of the things I asked for was, you know, when recommending topics, help me understand how those topics will then lead to actionable policy level advice. And that way we can take a look at those for consideration.
right. But, it's not necessarily a requirement.
For each topic, that's.
Yes.
I mean, it's not necessarily required, but it helps me better understand the purpose of those briefings, right? Because the charge to the board is to provide that actionable policy level advice.
Okay.
All right, I've got Pam, Tom, Jacob, and Dan Solitz online. Pam?
Okay, well, I've got a few that I would pull from the list. First of all, Phoenix is something that the River Plateau Committee has looked at for years and has been briefed on. And it's fascinating, but it's groundwater and groundwater plumes. And so I think it goes better to the other committee for a briefing.
I'll talk to that, yeah. That's
Okay.
what I'm in for.
Yeah,
Okay.
so Phoenix has tank data.
Yeah, so
Phoenix.
they added new stuff.
I know.
And Phoenix has pretty extensive tank
Yeah,
data.
Okay,
Yeah.
I guess it's been a while since I looked at it. Okay, so, and then in terms of fluidized bed and steam reforming, the national academies have been tasked like 3 times to look at that for Hanford tank waste. It's still not working in Idaho. There is no point for us looking at a technology that can't function with a much less complex wasteform. So I don't want to go down that path. That's my personal opinion.
Is it this? No, I guess I missed that TSCR.
Is that it?
Scroll up.
That's it.
It's me? Okay, so, I wanted to talk about Phoenix as well. That's a cross cutter now. It's got tanks, it's got, infrastructure, because we've got infrastructure now, it's got groundwater, it's got waste sites, so I'm thinking that needs to be part of orientation. And maybe the COE, the one that's taking the torch from Pick, next year, could be, because that's an outreach tool. It's so we can get information without having to have a meeting and then give that information to our constituents. I think, that, you know, we talked about maybe doing the leak assessment thing this fiscal year, so that wouldn't need to go on next year's work plan.
I don't think it'd be
If that's-
available.
If that's available in September.
The way that I looked at it, now, the college is gonna be in the review stage in September of it.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's due, Energy is due to submit it in August, was my understanding.
Right. To you,
Yeah, to
and
us.
then you're gonna get your comments back, and then Energy would then go to public.
Yeah, and then the leak response plan is gonna be rolled into the site-wide permit comment period in early 2024. So yeah, the leak response plan is gonna be part of the site-wide permit comment period.
So it won't be publicly available or be available for the head.
Would we
I'm not sure.
see it before that, site-wide?
That's what he's trying to
The
get.
generic
Yeah,
version.
exactly, yeah.
If you talk,
That
would be great.
I'll need to figure that out on what the timing's gonna look like for that.
And then the third thing I had was, something Ryan mentioned in RAP yesterday, which is sort of a cross pollination between health and safety and tanks, but, the vapor,
Yeah, I could say a few quick words. We don't have Matt on today. He talked about it yesterday, but ecology is going to start a comment period in the next couple weeks, most likely. And it's going to be on an approval order for thermal oxidation system, commonly known as NUCON for BY 108. And this would be an approval order to install that system. So that comment period is going to start sometime next. I don't have the exact dates right now because we're trying to finalize some of the processing kind of stuff and permitting documents, but that's going to be expected to start, I think, sometime this month. So just wanted to raise awareness to you guys for that and just keep an eye out because we'll send out a notice on Gov delivery, and then we'll do the website and all that stuff when it goes out.
And so it's important that we understand that the thermal oxidizer is to essentially reduce organic compounds.
From one tank, BY?
It's going to be for a test, like a 4-month test on BY 108, and it's going to be a 30-day comment period. And that, again, I can't get too far technical into what all, but that's kind of the Ryan level information.
Yeah.
Right. And these are airborne, aromatic.
Relating to tank vapors, yeah, for
Yes.
all the tank vapor stuff, yeah.
Right, okay.
Right, we've got Jacob and Dan Solitz.
Yeah, I guess I would say if you wanted to make Phoenix an orientation thing, I would be happy to do an orientation on the tanks part of Phoenix. Probably wouldn't take me long to learn the groundwater, but I'm intimately familiar with the tanks part, and I would be fully willing to do that, outside of a meeting like this. So I'll throw that ball.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good idea.
There is an IF team working on orientation. If you're interested in joining it, Mia's leading
And
that.
all you have
I
to do
don't,
is
but I'll
look
let
at
the
Mia.
EM team know.
Well, you're sitting right next to
Yeah,
Ellie.
right.
She's writing you down.
You might just have gotten drafted.
Yeah, and there's other databases that I think are public, I'll go check, that have similar sort of stuff with a little bit different bent that I've never heard mentioned in the HAB, and I'm sort of surprised. Like the databases on what they detect. If you go around town, you see, this is a stand where we are measuring air,
Right.
to measure radio equalize. All that data is out there publicly available, and fascinating, I find.
I know years ago, we got a presentation from Department of Health
Yeah.
on their 6 monitoring locations off the site.
Yeah.
And that was quite interesting because just after that, then we had Department of Health. No, we had the other state of Washington department made comments as to comparing what's at on-site versus what is not being seen offsite.
Yeah, so those are the sort of things that they're publicly available. I would bet most of us are unaware that if you'd like, I would be willing to collect, and you can put links to or part of the packet or whatever.
That'd be great.
There's a ton of monitoring type information in the world.
So, Mr. Chair, I've got one more person in queue for open forum and then committee business starting right now. So what do you want to do?
One more comment.
Okay, Dan, you're online. What's on your mind?
The high-level waste treatment plant redesign, the request for proposals. I'd like to have us have a presentation on that. The original issues were erosion, corrosion, hydrogen, and criticality. I've heard some reference to hydrogen in that they're going to improve the ventilation, but I haven't heard anything else on anything else. So I'd like to get some more information on that. And Lindsay, I don't know how that will be resulting in actionable advice, but I wouldn't know until we heard the presentation. So I hope that you'll consider that, the presentation on the request for proposal.
Would you be more specific so I can write that down?
Okay, my understanding is that there's going to be a request for proposals on the redesign of the high-level waste treatment facility, and that like to see the request for proposals and see how it addresses the original concerns about hydrogen, criticality, erosion, and corrosion.
And if there's a request for proposal in process and I haven't looked into that specific one, but if it's out on the street, that's not something that we could come brief the board on while it's in process.
Well, and I think today we heard that, next year would be the time to come back and brief again on
HLW.
HLW and the lessons learned and that type of thing. So that would be next
Yeah.
work year go.
If there's an RFP, and maybe there is, but I'm really surprised with that, there is opportunity for someone from the HAB to be briefed. Because I used to go from the community, and we did have HAB members come and comment on the draft. But it wouldn't be a committee issue. It would be like, and if somebody on the committee with expertise could say, well, have you thought about
With
this?
non-disclosures, and, yeah.
Right, so, I mean, it wouldn't be a HAB top thing, but there may be opportunity for input. But I don't think that's going on unless I'm totally clueless.
They also have a procurement webpage. You're welcome to go out and look at all of the, the procurements out there. You probably learn an awful lot of things going on.
Put that link on your list.
Yeah, then I gotta find it.
Okay, we're
Yeah,
kind of in a free form, but, yeah. I do have something free form here. If I had heard, and maybe the weapons complex monitor might say something, but there's been a challenge to the contract award.
Oh, I read
And
about that.
BTWX was somehow disqualified.
WXT.
Yeah,
That's not something I can comment on.
okay, but you know about it.
That's not something I can comment on.
So
I can comment.
I'll give you a couple sentences. So they proposed Carol Johnson to be the president of this company. And you guys have been around a long time. She was the president of the company that did River Corridor cleanup. And her husband was the president of Tank Farms. She's been retired for a long time. And BWXT said, yeah, she'll be picked for president and then she'll leave, which happens. That happened with our recent contract. And then there was a couple other things that I read about it where they were questioning DOE, that they hadn't adequately addressed some issues, but Carol Johnson was one of the main ones. And again, that's not something that we would engage in.
No, but it's kind of interesting that contract is,
Gossipy.
it was a big contract. What,
Steve, have you read something about it?
It's just a gossipy stuff, yeah.
So Rob, we're at 12:04 and committee business is supposed to start at 12. Do we want to,
okay,
if I get to that?
it's getting tough in here, isn't it? Let's go ahead. Committee business. Okay, what committee business do we have now?
What I had was, outlining your next meeting. My suggestion is maybe you clarify, yesterday there was a proposal about moving August committee meetings into September. That's probably worth talking about with this group.
Okay,
And then what topics you would like. It sounded to me like there were some ideas coming out from today's discussions that might make up your request to the agencies.
okay. So this list that we put up here is for the 23-24 work plan. So we still have the 22-23 work plan we're working on now. And that would be the August or September meeting.
Correct, right. So you have
Okay.
one more meeting as tank waste committee is currently constructed. This committee is evolving into, is it Twist? It's one of the committees that the scope didn't change as much as some of the other sorting. I'm looking at members of the operations work group to make sure that's right.
So we had scheduled in the previous work plan, our fourth meeting would be our low activity offsite waste disposal. And that's, and also system plan. And so is the system plan going to be anywhere near a review by the time we meet in September? Does anybody know?
No.
No, it won't be.
Likely not.
Okay, so
I had down that the August meeting was supposed to be TWC commissioning updates.
I think what he was looking at was the the main meeting outline, which is why he pushed that topic forward, so. But yeah, I have commissioning update outline for August, September timeframe.
Okay,
That'd be great.
that'd be great. And is there another topic that people have, we can do too?
What about the National Academy FFRDC study?
Yeah, if you want to look at Grout, let's see what they say.
Just informational, it could be committee led even.
Right. Would you think somebody would want to speak to us?
I can ask the question. I don't have an answer for you right now.
Okay. If we can get DOE to, give us a discussion on that, that would be great. And then, if, I know I'm putting you on the spot right now, but, do you, we could have, you present what your concerns are, and we get somebody to present, like Jacob there, his concerns, and then we all learn about what they are, and we feel if I put you on the spot.
I'll get back to you.
Okay. Okay, the idea is that, we're facing, some discussions of folks that, really resist the shipment of offsite waste, in a grouted form or in a liquid form or whatever form it is, which was certainly, suggested through the FFRDC and the recommendations out of that program. Actually, the recommendations that you to develop multiple paths, but and that would be one of them. Would we feel comfortable?
I think it would be cleaner and more productive to just have a discussion about the FFRDC report and save that for the IMT. That's just my personal.
Okay. Okay.
I agree, because one of the things that's in the plan for next year is the request for route advice. And that's a fiscal year 2024 activity, which, as Lindsay said yesterday, the existing former process was to start off with an agency briefing, which we have not had to date. We've been kind of off doing, the IM team has been off discussing and learning, but we haven't had that kickstart from the agencies.
Typically 50-50.
Okay,
IM teams are 50-50.
Yeah, so, but it's kind of, is that a September 23, which is fiscal year 23, or a fiscal year 24 action?
So how it was presented to me is it would come to the group in FY '24. What month that is, I don't know. So to try to say, yes, we can bring it in September, I can't do that right now. I'd have to get that information from the subject matter expert, so.
And just on the topic of grout and testbed initiative too, I'll talk with Lindsay after the meeting, because like I said, we'll see if there's any timely things we could present on, depending on the testbed initiative, but the permit gets, submitted, there's a comment period, so I'll talk with Lindsay after that, see if that's what timeliness there is with that.
Yeah, and there's a question as to whether the grout discussion that DOE wants to bring is the FFRDC NAS report, or whether they're two separate things.
Yeah.
Well, you bring up a good point if I can. The FFRDC was commissioned not by the Department of Energy. Right. They were commissioned by Congress. Now, certainly in FFRDC, this one resides at Savannah River. The NAS was commissioned to review the work. DOE is not the primary customer here. Congress is. Right. If you're looking for interest from DOE, you might consider separating that testbed initiative as being handled here. But what I'm not hearing in your conversation is what is it you want? Who do you want it from? Be careful who the customer is and who the provider is, because in this particular situation, grout is, if you will, segregated into a variety of initiatives. And each of the initiatives has a different customer and a different provider.
Yeah.
So do you think that we could get a discussion on TBI?
I don't have an answer for that.
I think that would kind of, because it's a precursor. And there's some tough questions there, like what kind of data are they gonna collect? and what's a performance factor and things of that sort.
Yeah.
So what I can do, and Brian, you said that we'd speak about TBI after this, is take that request and take it back and ask the question, but, today I can't commit to bringing that for September.
Yeah, and like, so I'll talk with Lindsay about it, because there is gonna be a comment period when, Energy submits the permit application to Ecology. I don't have the exact timeframe of when all that's gonna happen, but there is gonna be that public involvement component, but like, I said, I'll talk with Lindsay and we'll talk about timing and try and ask, our SME some questions.
Okay,
And I kind of think, Brian, we talked about some flexibility in the schedule, so there is, the opportunity for the HAB to be briefed in a timely manner. So if something does come up and it's, I guess, urgent that we bring it to the Tank Waste Committee, there's no reason that we can't add a call or something that would, ensure that you guys had all of the information when you needed to have it. So.
Yeah, exactly.
okay, so tentatively, we can put in a TBI discussion.
I think Ryan just communicated that we're going to
Check.
have that conversation after this. So no, tentatively, we can't
Okay.
agree to anything.
It's just on the list of.
It's on
to
your-
be
Yeah, I was gonna
considered.
say,
Listen
okay.
to be considered.
So
Yeah,
imagine,
that's my
imagine,
tentatively. was
Good
that-
try. You didn't quite get to the table.
Imagine there's a request list and there's a we can do it list.
We don't have any, we can do it.
Melter heat up and
It's all-
DFR update was all we can do it.
Yeah.
Right, great.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your comment.
Melter heat up and DFR update was on the yes list, right? Absolutely.
I don't know well, let me just confirm. I want to make sure that I have the appropriate people, because there's a lot of stuff that goes into bringing the briefings forward. One of those is making sure that folks are not on vacation, right? And so, that's it's a very important piece of the puzzle. So when I have your, I guess, for the lack of a better term, wish list of all of the things that you would like to hear about in September that are outside of what's already identified on the work plan for FY '23, I can go, reach out to those folks and say, hey, is there anything that we can bring to the board or to the Tank Waste Committee during this time frame, and are you in town to support it? So I appreciate all of the input and all of the requests. Pam, feel
So what happens at this time of year is the National Cleanup Workshop happens in Washington DC
yeah.
in September. And so you have, key people going to speak to the rest of the complex. And so I think it's that week.
Yeah, it overlaps that week. It overlaps committee week.
11.
Okay.
So I hope to attend that meeting by watching it on the computer.
Mhm.
Wow. It kind of upsets our plan for moving from August to September.
If we don't have the relevant folks here to present, but that's where I need to look into that for you.
Okay.
And I think, it's only June, so we've got plenty of time to get a head start on that.
Is the waste conference Monday through Friday?
No, it's generally the middle of the week. Generally starts like on Wednesday. It's on my calendar.
Yeah,
We could do
it's-
it on Tuesday. We could be,
We have the RAP committee meeting on Tuesday.
Yeah, the national meeting on this calendar is blocked out 11, 12, 13, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And committee week was 12 and 13. The proposal yesterday was to take the August committee meetings, because there's only 2 weeks between the August committee week and the board meeting. And that's a little tricky from a behind the scenes aspect. If the August days, which were the 8th and 9th, were combined with the 12th and 13th, so there'd be 3 full committee days in September, which is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That was a proposal yesterday.
And I think it also was a lot to ask of our out-of-town travelers to come in and then leave. And then, Tom, I believe you had overlap, correct?
Yeah.
For travel.
It was gonna be a challenge for, it's 5 weeks and three trips, is sort of crazy.
Yeah, that's a lot for,
And the travel budget as well. For
That
economy
too.
of scale.
and we did talk about this yesterday, but as we took a look at the FY '24 calendar, the agencies really took the opportunity to try to set a schedule that wouldn't bring forward a lot of changes. So as that schedule comes forward, we're hoping to stick to it so folks can plan accordingly versus, last minute swapping things out. But we appreciate the flexibility.
so we'll talk about this more tomorrow then?
The work plan? Yes. For FY '24 is tomorrow, correct. And I do have your request for the September.
23. Well, this is.
Right, and then, but when will this decision be made to
To,
move them to September?
I mean, we can talk about it more tomorrow at the leadership workshop, so if you want to.
Let's do it.
I did reach out to Sue and Mia, and they did not see any issues with moving the committee week. But we want to make sure that all of the committee leadership has the opportunity to weigh in on that.
Yeah, because right now, the RAP and BCC are already on the 12th and 13th. So it's just moving the PIC and the tanks to that. Basically, PIC to be half of the day, half of the 13th, and share the day between BCC and PIC, and then the 14th, Thursday, the 14th, be tanks.
The other thought is it puts more HAB members in town for the last meeting of these committees before they change names or missions. So we could have something extracurricular, officially or unofficially, to commemorate that.
Is there a vote of the HAB on the changes that you're proposing?
It was in August, I mean, April.
Yeah, the new committee structure passed.
Okay.
Yeah, it was passed at the April board meeting.
Jared?
As an observer who was on the HAB for many years, I just want to say, I don't see how you can meet the charge of the HAB and the expectation of the public and yourselves meeting just 4 times a year. The agency's just spent, I think, 6 years on holistic negotiations. We've talked about having needs for just briefing and discussion, which may lead to advice, certainly should lead to advice on leak response, on leak response plan, the entire tanks permit, which in the past took like 20 meetings of this committee and the board to review and provide input on, and for the Public Environment Committee. You're talking about TBI, you're talking about system plan, and you're talking about an entire revision of the entire Hanford tank waste program. And you might, even if you could be briefed on all of those and have discussions, you wouldn't have time to develop it in order to give advice for the board. Just saying, I think that is a real step backwards for the board and the region. If you're limited to 4 meetings a year, you can't possibly meet the expectations and provide meaningful advice on what is in front of you for this year.
Same with the restriction on committee meetings.
Yeah, that's definitely something to discuss tomorrow at the leadership workshop. And yes, we're ready to have that conversation.
Okay. Question, just for clarity, Jerry mentioned that the permit, I don't remember you mentioning that as one of the things on your list. Did you mention the permit?
No. But I mentioned the,
In likelihood, there's probably gonna be a multi-committee work group
It's like a
on Rev
committee
9 that isn't.
Yeah, we've got Rev 9 on the work plan right now. We'll talk more about it tomorrow for Rev 9, and then we should consider tomorrow talking about the leak response plan, because I just was thinking about it too. We talked about potentially September, but again, I'll have to talk to my folks about it. But Energy is submitting to Ecology at the end of August the leak response plan. I'd hazard a guess and say 2 weeks probably isn't enough for Ecology to review and provide their comments on it. So like I said, we'll see about September, but that might be a topic that might need to wait until fall time to do that topic. But yeah, well, and like I said, the leak response plan is part of Rev 9. So I think it's worth mentioning, maybe leak response plan, maybe in association with Rev 9 on the work plan, because currently the leak response plan isn't on the, I don't think it's on the work plan. So that's something we talk about.
leak response plan. I think that's into the next season.
Might wanna add the
I do want to put an exclamation mark on my question, because this Rev 9 is going to have all of the tank components in the permit, and this will be the first time you'll see a permit for SSD closure, for DST operations, and there's interest, this committee has specific interest on both of those. So I just want to highlight that for everybody to be aware of that. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for ecology too. It's taken us like 12 or 15 years to come up with this permit. So it's a big deal.
Well,
I really think you can-
so there's some work that we never did this year, System Plan 10. We never saw that, and that's important. And we're on hold until that gets completed. So, so for the meetings next, for our next topic, I have the one, is the update on the WTP or the DF law, the melter ascension to power and et cetera. And then the second one is whether it's going to be what ecology can give us from the standpoint of the leak, if that's possible. If or if DOE can give us some information on the TBI.
Yeah, and I can promise, like I said, Lindsay and I will be diligent on trying to track those as soon as we can and following up on those topics, potential topics.
Okay.
Then the third option was the FRDC, if neither of those work.
Yeah. So it's kind of, we're one firm one and three possibilities. And chances are that one of the three will be good.
And we do have, I believe, an EIC call later this month, and so my hope is that I'll have an answer for you then.
Okay. Sounds good. Wow. I think we're getting to be done. However, Lindsay's got to end it for us.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Rob. This meeting's been adjourned.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.